to today's first session of the Delaware Native Species Commission's Delaware Naturally Spring into Action series. I have to say we had a really good registration with over 190 folks signed up. We'll see how many actually sign in. I wouldn't say that this would be my first choice to have a summit, but I guess under the current circumstances, I think we've done an excellent job of have an excellent program for you today. I will say this is the second attempt to hold this summit. The first was a little less than a year ago, when of course things changed dramatically for us, including we had to cancel the original summit. So again, I welcome you all to the summit today. The primary goal of our summit series is to basically assist conservationists and conservation-minded Delawareans to forge a new collaborative partnership to protect Delaware's flora and fauna. I think we have a great program today. We have three main speakers: Senator Stephanie Hansen, Collin O'Mara from the National Wildlife Federation, Dr. Doug Tallamy from the University of Delaware. We also have a special event today. The signing into law of a bill that would ban the sale of many invasive plant species. And there's going to be a lot more about that as we go on. As you know, this summit is a series and consists of 3 sessions. Our next session will be on March 24th, and the third session on March 31st. March 24th, 4th, and 31st. Before we get started, though, I would like to thank some folks who really worked very hard to make this summit happen. It took a lot of work, especially when we had to shift from an in-person series to a virtual series. But I'd like to thank the folks at Delaware Center for Horticulture. They've done a lot to help us host this series, and they did a lot with publicity. Also, I'd like to thank Mount Cuba and all their staff. They've done a lot of work for helping us put this together and to get things ready for today. Also, like to thank Sheila Smith for all her work on the summit, and especially want to thank Helen Fischel. Helen was in charge of putting this summit together, and again, she put 2 summits together, one in person and now the second virtually. This took a lot of work, to say the least, and I definitely want to thank her for the commission for all the work she's done. Before I turn it over to our next speaker, I would like to say a little bit about the Delaware Native Species Commission and how it started and where we're at now. In May of 2017, the Delaware Senate passed a concurrent resolution that created the statewide Ecological Extinction Task Force. This was a group that was to study the decline in plant and animal species in Delaware and recommend solutions to reverse the present course. Senator Stephanie Hansen was the primary sponsor of this bill, and you're going to hear from Stephanie, and we're going to talk a lot about Senator Hansen as we go along. There were 19 members of this task force, and it was a balanced representation of government, academia, environmental organizations. Other stakeholders were included, such as the nursery industry, Farm Bureau, State Chamber of Commerce, realtors, and the development community. Also, a balance of both chambers in the General Assembly and representation of all counties was very important for this task force. The object of the task force was to encourage discussion and debate among this diverse group of interests, with the ultimate goal of putting forth recommendations that would have widespread support and the best chance of implementation. We came up, the task force came up with, 77 or more recommendations, but they were in basically 9 categories: education, incentivizing private landowners, government leads by example, legislation that would affect development, funding for open space program at the statutory level, legislation to prohibit the sale of invasive species, deer management, the Recovering America's Wildlife Act, and finally, the formation of the Delaware Native Species Commission. Senator Hansen is still very active with our commission. So the Delaware Native Species Commission is made up of a very similar makeup of the task force. We have a lot of stakeholders at the table. A variety of interests are discussed. But we're to exist for 10 years. Our primary goal is to carry out the recommendations of the task force. So those 77 recommendations, we have broken them down, and we are dividing and conquering these recommendations. But to summarize all the recommendations into one relatively simple statement, we are charged to find ways to conserve plants and animals in Delaware. That's the bottom line. This brings me basically to our next speaker, the first speaker actually, Senator Stephanie Hansen. Senator Hansen is a driving force behind many conservation efforts currently underway in Delaware. She is leading the way in the Delaware State Legislature to protect and conserve Delaware's natural resources. She is, as I explained, probably the primary reason we are here today. Her insight and her actions and her hard work has allowed us to continue with our commission's work, to work with many stakeholders to conserve plants and animals in Delaware. So I'd like to introduce our next speaker. That is Senator Stephanie Hansen.
You're on mute, sorry.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you very much for your kind words. Jim has been one of the driving forces as well behind all the conservation work that we're doing now, and particularly with the Delaware Native Species Commission. So, and thank you all for spending some time with us this morning. With a little luck and a few more months, maybe we can start to get together again in person. This year has been a much more productive year legislatively than last year. Last year, the legislature was really focused on how to meet virtually, technology-wise, and then even educational-wise, getting us all on the same page with figuring out how to use the technology. Now we're on that, and we're able to have more of a productive legislative session. So one of the primary results of that has now been the passage of Senate Bill 22, which is the ban on the sale of invasive species. We actually had this bill ready to go last year, and you know, like so many other things, it got COVIDed with our legislative session, so we weren't able to get it passed. But any discussion of Senate Bill 22 really needs to start with Professor Doug Tallamy. Because he was the inspiration for this bill many years ago. With he and his graduate students like Ashley Kennedy, who have worked on documenting and researching the decline in our native species in the state of Delaware for many years. I remember seeing a presentation that Dr. Tallamy gave at the Department of Natural Resources a number of years ago when I was just there as an attorney listening in, an environmental attorney listening in. And I was shocked by the precipitous decline in not just plants, but birds and plants and reptiles and amphibian and fishes. It's the bottom half of our ecosystem, which to me was just alarming. Because I thought I've been involved in the environmental field really for all of my adult life as a professional. First as a scientist with the Department of Natural Resources, then as an environmental attorney. And this was not something that I was really aware of. And that to me was alarming. And that to me also seemed to be this generation's silent spring. That's kind of how it really seemed. And I thought, I've got to be able to do something about this. So at the time, I was just a practicing attorney, and I hadn't been elected yet into the Senate. And so I asked Dr. Tallamy to come and give his presentation to the other environmental lawyers of the bar and land use lawyers as well. And after that, I thought, I've got to be able to do more. And then the election happened. I was fortunate enough to be elected to the state Senate, and really one of the first things I wanted to do was bring attention to this issue and start to turn this ship around. So we did the Ecological Extinction Task Force and brought together this group of people, first of all, to find out, to really come to an understanding and a consensus, a broad understanding and consensus that this is in fact a real problem. And if it is a real problem, what do we need to do about it? So I want to thank the members of the Extinction Task Force, and I'm going to list them, and then our Native Species Commission, because this was a huge lift. I mean, to have environmental legislation, which in the end passed unanimously in the General Assembly, which is what our invasive species legislation did, that's almost unheard of. An environmental piece of legislation that passed unanimously is almost unheard of. So let's talk for just a second, because I really want to thank the people that have been a part of this heavy lift since 2017. First, it's the 4 members of the legislature. I made sure that we included a member of each caucus. That was, of course, myself in the Senate, Bryant Richardson from the Minority Caucus, Deborah Heffernan, who we'll hear from later today as well. This is our state representative. She is the chair of the House Environmental Committee, was on the Extinction Task Force, and Representative Ron Gray. From Sussex County, we had Mike Costello. From Newcastle County, Tracy Searles. From Kent County, Mike Petitdemange. The administrative agencies were represented as well, with Joe Rogerson from DENREC, Faith Kuhn, represented the Department of Agriculture's Plant Industries, Chris Basin from the Delaware Center for the Inland Bays, Maria Evans from the Delaware Association of Realtors, Sue Barton from the Delaware Landscape and Nursery Association, Catherine Holtz from the Delaware Farm Bureau, Doug Tallamy, of course, Doug Tallamy from the University of Delaware, Robert Thornton from the Home Builders Association, Jim White, our esteemed Jim White, from our Delaware Nature Society, Sarah Cooksey from the Delaware Nature Conservancy, and Kathy Stiller, who represented the Delaware State Chamber of Commerce. So that was the list of people that were on the task force that met for about 9 months or so in marathon sessions sometimes. Those sessions went hours, and they were lively, because you can imagine when you get those different groups of people together, they're not all going to think the same way. But the idea was to let's get everyone on the same page with regard to, do we have a problem? And if we do, how big is that problem? And then what can we agree are the things that we need to do going forward? So as Jim said, there were a number of recommendations put together. There was actually 81 recommendations that were put together, and they were organized in different categories. And one of the first things we recognized is that a task force is of a very limited duration. So in order for someone to now implement those recommendations, the first thing you have to do is put together who that someone's going to be, what that someone is going to look like. So that is what led to the establishment of the Delaware Native Species Commission, whose job it is then to go back and implement the recommendations of the Extinction Task Force. So I want to take a second now to recognize the members of the Delaware Native Species Commission. And you'll see that there's quite a crossover because it worked so well. That was really the winning formula with the task force as to who are the groups that need to come together and the balance of those groups that need to come together so that you end up with a product that will pass legislatively and that has broad support. So the members of the Native Species Commission today, we have, of course, our chair, Jim White, Dave Savikas, representing DENREC, Jessica Einhoff from the Department of Agriculture, Darren Calloway from the Department of Transportation. You wouldn't think the Department of Transportation would have as much interaction with the issue of invasive species, but they do. They have a lot of interaction with invasive species, with all of the road building and the habitat creation and wetland creations that they need to do. So there's quite a bit of that. Tracy Searles from Newcastle County, Mike Petitdemange from Kent County, Mike Costello from Sussex County, Matt Sarver is our botanist, Sarah Cooksey, Delaware Audubon, Christopher Heckscher from Delaware State University, Jeff Downing from Mount Cuba, Sue Barton, University of Delaware, Sheila Smith, Delaware Ornithological Society, Kitty Holtz from the Delaware Farm Bureau, Jim McCulley from Watershed Echo, Robert Thornton, Silverstock Developers, Lori Athey from Guided Path, Janice Truitt from the Delaware African American Farmers Association, and Valan Budashek from the Delaware Landscape Association. So you'll see that there is some crossover, but the idea was to keep that same structure that worked so well with the task force with the Native Species Commission. So as I mentioned, Senate Bill 22 took a little bit longer than we thought to pass because of COVID, but it passed unanimously. And this illustrates really the strength of working together, listening to all interests, and coming together based in a common understanding of the problem and the solution. And this solution came to us through really one of our members. It came to us through the nursery and landscape industry, because they recognized that invasive species are a real problem. They recognized that selling them was a real problem, but they also recognized how popular these things are. You know, if they stop selling burning bush at one home and garden center, people are just going to turn around and go buy burning bush someplace else, or calorie or Bradford pear. You know, all of those things. So they said, if you could legislatively level the playing field, that will help us all, and that will help with the problem that we're currently facing. Because what the big takeaways that Professor Tallamy and his students came up with is that there are four primary drivers of the loss of our native species. Those are habitat loss, habitat fragmentation, climate change, and invasive species. So we kind of jumped onto this issue of what can we do about invasive species. So Senate Bill 22 prohibits the import, sale, export, transport, distribution, or propagation of any plant identified by the Secretary of the Department of Agriculture with the advice of the Delaware Native Species Commission as an invasive plant, starting with the list currently identified in the legislation. The act also requires that plants identified as potentially invasive be sold with a tag that identifies them as potentially invasive, because that's really needs to start as a warning. That's a warning. You know, you're not going to be able to buy this set of plants anymore because they're invasive. But here's another group that we're looking at really carefully right now, and that have some characteristics that we think could likely land them in that invasive category in the future, and they may find their way back on that list where they're not going to be able to be sold anymore. So we want people to be warned about these. Think twice about whether or not you really want to plant these in your yard, because they're a problem with our ecosystem. So what are some of those plants? Now, there's 37 of them that are listed in Senate Bill 22. I'm not going to go over all 37 of them. I'll go over some, and some are not widely in commerce right now, although you can still buy some of them on the internet. We have multiflora rose, Japanese honeysuckle, Oriental bittersweet, Japanese stiltgrass, Japanese knotweed, autumn olive, Norway maple, mile-a-minute weed, European privet, Japanese barberry, another very popular plant that you find in home and garden stores. Lesser periwinkle, also known as vinca, another one that you find very, very often. Burning bush, calorie pear, also known as Bradford pear, tree of heaven, water hyacinth, English ivy. People don't think that of English ivy as being invasive, because many times we think, well, it's been here for such a long time. How can it possibly be invasive? Well, it has been here a long time. It's been here since about, the 1700s or so, when people began coming over. But when the United States, when America became colonized, so it came over from England in that area. But now that it's here, who hasn't seen a tree near an urbanized or suburban area with ivy just choking the tree, growing up along it. How did that happen? Well, it happened because English ivy, like so many of our invasive plants that we plant in our yard, they don't stay in our yard. They escape. They escape. They run across the road. They run into the woods. They go up and down Route 301 or Route 1 now, when you see the big white puffy trees, the same ones that you see in shopping centers and lining the trees in many suburban developments. Those are the Callery pears, AKA Bradford pears. They weren't planted on Route 1 north or south along those berm areas. Those have all escaped, and they've all supplanted our many of our native species in those areas. So orange daylily is another that's now part of the prohibition. Yellow flag iris, creeping jenny, Japanese pachysandra, Chinese wisteria. If you'd like to take a look at the other ones, please go back. Just go and take a look on, you go on the General Assembly's website under Senate Bill 22, and you can pull up the legislation and it will tell you. And these are a good start. They're not the end, but they're a good start. So the next questions, though, that come to mind is, and that we're going to start looking at, because we're always talking about what are the next steps. Well, the next step with this legislation is how do we update that list? Because we've asked that the list be updated. It'll be updated with the Department of Agriculture, but exactly how is that going to happen? And how often does that happen? We're going to start looking at that, because that's not a question or issue that we could really get to with this first bite of the apple. Same questions again with, well, now that we've stopped the sale of these, what about the things that are already here and that have escaped and that are forming these mass areas of invasive species where very little else grows? How do we deal with those? That's another question that we have to start looking at. So, you know, we make progress a step at a time. The important thing, though, is to not stop. Don't stop stepping. Keep walking. Keep getting to the next issue. And so we'll be doing that. Now, Senate Bill 22, the invasive species bill, is not the only bill environmentally that we've been able to do this year. We've been able to do more than that. And I'll just give you kind of a quick rundown on some of the other things that we're also doing legislatively right now in the environmental realm. One of them is the ban on the mass release of balloons. That's another issue that we had been working on for a couple of years, another issue that got COVIDed last year when the General Assembly wasn't able to meet, but that this year is moving along pretty well. It's already passed the Senate. Today, it's actually being heard by the House Environmental Committee at noon. So at noon, I'm going to skedaddle quickly out from here and then go over to the House Environmental Committee so that I can provide any testimony for that bill. And what that bill does is it bans the mass release of balloons. It prohibits the mass release of balloons. And by mass, we mean 5 balloons or more. 1 to 4 balloons is still considered littering. So you can't do that either. It's still considered littering, and it's still subject to, in this case, it would be a $25 fine. It's the intentional release of a balloon. But 5 or more is the mass release of balloon, and that's where you get to the larger fines. And that fine is $250. So we spent a lot of time working on that bill and taking a look at what other states were doing in this area, because there are 10 other states and or municipalities that have banned this mass release of balloons. And the question is, well, how many is a mass? So you have different states that'll say 10, and some will say 25, and some will say 5. So what was right for us? So in doing that, I thought, well, we're a coastal state. We're impacted a lot. The release of balloons is a terrible detriment to our terrestrial and marine life. It causes injury and death, and we need to do something about that. So looking to our neighbor in Queen Anne's County, Maryland, we chose the 5, the number of 5 balloons or more. We also, though, recognize that there are many communities, there are many communities that use balloon releases as a way to mark not just celebrations, but memorials as well. And one of the things that was made really clear during the bill writing and drafting process and the hearing process in the Senate is that there are many cultures that use the release of balloons in memorials and celebrations, but particularly memorials. And it would be a really unfortunate, a really not a right thing to do, to go to someone who is just, you know, there's been a service, they've just lost a loved one, and now we're going to hit them with a $250 fine for a mass release of balloons. So an amendment was placed on the bill so that for individuals, there is an education period, really. And that education period where it's still illegal, you're just not going to get the fine associated, the penalty associated for 1 year. And that 1 year is till April of 2022. Organizations they're still going to be subject to the fine because there's really less of an excuse with that. And for many of the communities that are involved in memorials, a $250 fine is very difficult for them. So what we're hoping is that through this next year process, working with the African American Task Force, which is who we had worked with in putting the amendment together, that we can get the word out to the communities that this practice needs to change, that it's very detrimental to our environment. And so I think that we'll be able to get it through. If you're interested in helping with that, and I would encourage you to help with that, please reach out to your state representative at this point. You can also register to speak at the hearing today, or to make your voice known to your representatives. Plastic Free Delaware through Dee Durham and Suzanne Thurman through the Murr Institute had a great deal to do with the creation of this bill, and they both have information about the bill and how to have an impact and advocate for the passage of this bill on their respective websites. So if you go to the Murr Institute website, you'll see it. If you go to Plastic Free Delaware website, you'll see information to the balloon bill there as well. We also have another bill that has actually passed the Senate, and it's over in the House, and it has to do with the creation of a pollinator license plate. So there's a story behind this. Remember how I had said earlier that you'd be surprised that DelDOT has anything to do in this invasive species realm or native species realm? Well, they do. They actually create a number of large pollinator habitats. And the idea for the creation of a special license plate recognizing pollinators and native species came from DelDOT, their environmental science group. It came from Christy Bonnewell and Jamie Pavona, Scott Clapper. It was their idea. They had approached me about it when we went to take a look at the Dove's Nest pollinator area that they had set up down here in southern Newcastle County. And so they said it would be great if we had a license plate that recognized this. And so a funny story, you know, we start putting together the license plate, and there are, you know, there's template birds and animals and things to put on, you know, things like license plates. Well, as it turned out, none of those template butterflies, birds, plants were Delaware native species, yet it was going to be saying, you know, plant native species. So I spoke with Secretary Jen Cohen, who was the Secretary of DelDOT at the time, and they agreed to a special appropriation so that DelDOT could cover the additional costs that it was going to take to actually design one with Delaware native species. So we had the DelDOT folks and their environmental group and members of the Delaware Native Species Commission. And thank you very much to Denrek and Dave Savikas. If you'll, the plants, birds, insects that are on here are all, in fact, Delaware native species. So this is it's to be a $50 plate. I'm going to get one. The additional money, the money raised from the plate will go to promote native species and pollinator habitat. And so, you know, that I think it's wonderful. I'm happy about it. I don't think it's controversial. It has made its way through the Senate. It's already been through the House Environmental Committee at this point. It still has to come to the House for a vote. I can't imagine somebody being against it. Who knows? Maybe somebody will be. You never know. You know, there are many personalities down there. So as long as you're if you're going to advocate for 24, Senate Bill 24, which is the balloon bill, think about advocating maybe for Senate Bill 23 too. That's our pollinator license plate bill. And we should be able to get that passed pretty quickly. Another big bill that we were able to get done through the Senate and the House, and has actually been signed by the governor, is our renewable portfolio standard bill. So this increases the amount of the percentage of renewable energy that we need to have in Delaware's energy portfolio. It increases it up to 40% by 2035. We are continuing to look into increasing it even further. And that's being done in conjunction with discussions regarding community solar. So right now, if you're interested in the energy field, and I know I'm getting a little further away from native plants, but this is sort of under the environmental umbrella. I've been holding energy and climate forums. We've held 3 at this point. On things like our renewable portfolio standard, on community solar, on offshore wind. And now we have a community solar stakeholders group that's working on legislation that perhaps we will have regarding community solar going forward, and perhaps an increase in our RPS as well. So we're looking at that. And I think probably lastly is I have a piece of legislation, although it is not environmental in nature, it will affect you and affect the environmental boards, commissions, any of the public bodies. It's called the virtual meetings legislation. This is very similar to the legislation that was passed last year that I actually got done. This is not a piece of my legislation last year didn't get COVIDed because it was all about COVID. It was all about how you're able to meet as a board, as an advisory board and commission during these period of times. You can meet virtually and have that your participation count towards quorum and being able to conduct business. Well, what this new legislation is going to do, and it's going to be released in, I would say probably over the next week or two, or just about there, is it's going to codify that. It's going to make that a permanent ability going forward, not just the ability to meet virtually during a state of emergency or with regard to a governor's order, but the ability to meet virtually and count for quorum and conduct your business going forward permanently. And it will apply not to just advisory boards and commissions, it will apply to all public bodies. So this is really meant so that everyone can continue to stay connected. It is discretionary on the part of the public body. So the public body does not have to meet virtually, but they can meet virtually. And so that's really an important piece of this. So with that, I think I may stop to see if we had any questions over in the chat. People liking the plate, thank you. Well, thank you very much. I think probably what I can do is start the introduction. I know we have, our next speaker is Collin Amara. And Collin Amara was just really a hero of mine, a hero and a mentor of mine for many years when he was here and came to us from California. And, you know, he was, I guess, the youngest, one of the youngest folks that we've had that has led DENREC and our state on environmental issues. And if you knew Collin, you knew that you had to listen real close because he can talk. He can really make his way through a lot of material in a very short period of time. So he was actually, once he left DNREC, in 2014. He was part of the Markell administration, 2009 to 2014. And he currently serves as the president and CEO of the National Wildlife Federation, which is America's largest wildlife conservation organization. And it has over 6 million members in 52 state and territories. And under Mr. O'Mara's leadership, the National Wildlife Federation is focused on uniting all Americans to ensure wildlife thrive in our rapidly changing world. The Federation works with both Republicans and Democrats to protect wildlife, restore habitat, ensure healthy waters, defend public lands, provide environmental education, and connect people with the great outdoors. And they publish the Ranger Rick magazine. As I'd mentioned, prior to joining the National Wildlife Federation, Collin O'Mara led Delaware's DNREC under the Markell administration from 2009 to 2014. And in that capacity, he spearheaded a number of initiatives that I think you might remember. First of all, Delaware's No Child Left Inside, the Delaware's Children in Nature campaign, the First State Trails and Pathways Plan, and the Delaware Bayshore Initiative. He also championed efforts to improve the Cape Region State Parks, including the soon-to-be completed, a few years ago, Gordon's Pond Trail in Cape and Lopin State Park, and the camping facilities at Delaware Seashore State Park. One of the things that Secretary O'Mara worked on at that time was the Clean Water Initiative, which looked very different at that time. At that time, that was a very large $800 million initiative to clean the state's waterways, and included infrastructure improvements for wastewater, stormwater, and drinking water projects throughout the state by the institution of a clean water fee. So time has passed. Here we are in 2021, but the idea of the Clean Water Bill has come back again. It has come back in the form of House Bill 200. You may remember that from, I believe it was last year when it was first introduced, and like everything else, many things got set aside, but House Bill 200 is up on the agenda now. And I think that I'm feeling pretty good about the fate of the bill. I'm one of the sponsors on it as well. The prime sponsor is Representative Longhurst over in the House. So without any further ado, I will turn it over to our illustrious former son, Collin O'Mara.
Thank you, Senator. It's great to be with you, and I love being able to call you Senator and have you leading on so many of these issues from the inside. I apologize for being a few minutes late. My wife was actually on CNN, and so I'm a little frazzled. She was talking about the immigration crisis at the border, and the internet kind of kicked out. We didn't know we could both be on at the same time. So life is chaotic as always. I was really excited when I got the invitation to be with all of you today, because I think due to Stephanie's leadership, all of a sudden now we have political muscle to talk about how kind of restoration of native plants, of kind of restoring biodiversity more broadly, should be a statewide priority. And I can't say enough about Senator Hansen. I mean, I think in her short time in the legislature, she's repeatedly shown that we can have really smart, savvy, forward-looking environmental policy in ways that actually create jobs, that improve the quality of life, that make Delaware even a better place to live, hopefully with richer and more diverse, more biodiversity. And so, Senator, thank you for everything that you're doing. It really is a national model, and I just want to praise you for having had a chance to work all across the country. The work you're doing here really is just absolutely phenomenal. So a huge thank you. So I was excited to join you all because I do think we're at a bit of an inflection point right now, and it's obviously been a rough year on many levels. I'm actually down at the beach right now, but and in Wilmington most of the year. And, whereas we're facing these 4 historic crises that, President Biden talks all the time, the pandemic, the economic recession, a civil rights reckoning around racial justice, and the climate crisis. A lot of the solutions that we need to advance kind of all of those actually lie in our natural systems. And I'd include kind of a fifth crisis, which is the biodiversity crisis, as part of that conversation. We're in a moment in time right now where, rethinking systems, thinking more bigger, thinking more broadly about, how we put people to work, how we make ourselves more resilient, how we kind of address challenges in a more intersectional way, is incredibly important. And the case I want to make for all of you today is that we should no longer think of the work that we're trying to do together to conserve biodiversity as simply an environmental nicety, but it really could be an economic necessity for the state. States that have strong natural resources, healthy natural resources, are doing better during this pandemic, as more and more people are turning to nature as a way to kind of survive the incredible stress and all the anxiety that's been caused by the coronavirus. We're seeing places that, especially places, again, when folks aren't flying, when folks are driving to, kind of destinations, again, smart, masked ways to socially distance and all the caveats, places that have had healthier natural resources have done better. I mean, I'm down here right now, just kind of outside of Rehoboth, and I guess I'm in Rehoboth, and it's, there are a lot of people here. Now, there's public health concerns about some of that, making sure folks are socially distant, but we're well outside the season. And one of the reasons, though, is that we've been able to restore our natural resources to a greater extent than other places, even though we have a ways to go. The wildlife crisis that we all face right now is serious, and there's about 1/3 of all U.S. species, that's plants, animals, vertebrates, invertebrates, are at heightened risk of extinction. About 1/3. The state wildlife agencies across the country have identified more than 12,000 species of greatest conservation need that are in desperate need of our help. And in the U.S., just given the kind of the North American model of wildlife conservation, we've done a pretty good job in this country, bringing back most of the things we hunt and fish. If you can't drive through the Brandywine 100 right now without seeing white-tailed deer crossing the road or in the backyard. The challenge is that we haven't given the same amount of attention to everything else. And that's why the resolution that Senator Hansen led a few years ago in this commission, and the work that is being done through so many amazing organizations across the great state of Delaware is so important. I think about the years of leadership of like the Delaware Nature Society, the Center for Horticulture, the work of all the invasive plant and native plant organizations that have been going on for years. But we've never had the same kind of level of kind of political support that I think we have now because of Senator Hansen's leadership. And what I want to talk to you today about is we're going to need to figure out a way to marry up the bottom-up work that's been going on for so many years. I mean, I couldn't be more proud. I think it's something like 2,200 Delaware households have certified their habitat as like certified wildlife habitat through DNS and the National Wildlife Federation. I mean, that's 1% of all houses. I mean, it doesn't seem like a big number. It's huge. I mean, it's like proportionally, that's a huge number of folks that are actively, planting for wildlife. You think about all the native plant sales and the work that, the folks have been doing up in Wilmington around, native trees, and all of these conversations, lend itself to kind of a very fertile ground for us to not just be first in the nation in terms of when we signed the Constitution, but actually first in the nation in terms of ecological restoration. And then on top of that, I mean, we literally have the world leading expert in all things kind of native plants and in interrelation between native plants and kind of broader fauna biodiversity in Doug Tallamy, who you'll hear from in a little while. So you have world-class, academic leadership. You have best-in-class nonprofits. You have, kind of unprecedented kind of political leadership. And so now it's just a matter of putting the pieces together. And so I would love to, talk today for a little bit about how knowing kind of where we are in terms of the number of species that need help, again, both flora and fauna, given kind of where we are positionally in terms of our budget and kind of resources and some of the needs we're going to need for the future, and given the assets that we have outside of government, how do we put those pieces together to really become the best state in the country when it comes to ecological restoration of native habitat. And I think the pieces are, I mean, as I said, the pieces are there, and I think one thing that I would love to, work with all of you on is how do we take these like individual efforts that are there and really scale them up. And so I'll give you just one example. A couple of years ago, Stephanie and myself and folks from DNS and some others were with Matt Meyer, the great county executive of Newcastle County, who issued a executive order saying that, he wanted to see more native plants in the landscaping budget for Newcastle County. And a lot of you worked on this behind the scenes. There's a lot of work that went into it. But the thing that was brilliant about that effort, and which was one of the first in the country to do it, I think he was in the first handful, was that it was basically saying, look, if we're going to spend money anyway, let's spend it better. Let's spend it based on native plants. Let's spend it based in ways that are going to help have multiple benefits across a whole range of species. On the DNREC side, we've seen great efforts over the last couple of years around ecological restoration in places like Prime Hook and in Mississippi Harbor, working with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. You're seeing restoration of different riparian corridors, trying to use natural infrastructure, native plants, as a way to help build the resilience of communities all across this state. Because we know from our experience with Hurricane Sandy and subsequent storms that maybe haven't been as named or as powerful, that places that have healthy resources, healthy dunes, healthy wetlands, healthy vegetation, they survive these storms a lot better, right? They are more they are able to absorb more. They're able to absorb kind of the intensity of the storms. They're able to kind of slow down both the velocity and absorb more of the volume of water. And at the same time, we know they provide incredible habitat. So we're seeing that woven in more and more places. The conservation districts are trying to use more native plants. And so one of the pieces that we haven't quite gotten to yet is thinking about kind of state procurement more broadly. And the amount that we spend on landscaping. I mean, I've had nightmare experiences in the past where, not in Delaware, but other states where, you do a lot of native, habitat in median strips and, different corridors just to have, somebody mow it over because they didn't realize they were native plants. They just thought they were weeds. But like thinking through how we use all the different levers of government, again, not with, in many cases, not with any additional cost, but basically just doing things better, and really sending a signal that we're going to manage our landscaping, our different restoration projects with wildlife, with biodiversity in mind. And again, getting to that place, again, there's change, and anytime there's change, and there's always a little bit of resistance, but there is also at the same time a huge opportunity, because in that announcement, one of the things that Matt Meyer did is also send a signal to business saying, hey, if you invest in cultivating more native plants, there's going to be a market for it. One of the things that's so important about like the Delaware Nature Society's like native plant sale, or like the work with the certified wildlife habitats, is that you're sending a signal saying, hey, if you're willing to supply these things, there's folks that are going to buy them. This is why I'm so proud of the work that we've done over many years with Doug Tallamy, trying to have what we call our native plant finder, and I'll put the link into the chat. But it's basically a website where you can kind of type in your zip code. So I'm normally up in 19805, and so if you type in 19805, you'll see a whole range of native species and also the wildlife they support. And this gets back to Doug's research, which I'm sure he'll go into. But we know that when we plant native trees, they support so many more species of caterpillars, so support so many more species of birds. The symbiotic relationship between native plants and kind of the full diversity of wildlife really is one of those, kind of great natural evolutions where we know that we can support the species we need just by planting better in many cases. And this gets back to the basic tenets of having good habitat, having good cover for young, having good places to hide from predators, having good food sources, good water sources, as a way to have the full biodiversity. One of the things that I failed in when I was secretary, when I was secretary, we were facing some pretty lean years. I mean, I came in 2009 at the depths of the kind of Great Recession. Money was always pretty tight, but we have one of the best state wildlife action plans in the country. The team that puts it together, folks like Anthony, folks like Karen Bennett. I mean, there's a team at DNREC that's been doing it. I'm sure there's new folks that are part of it now too. But that's basically the roadmap for how to save the full diversity of wildlife. And many of you know this. Many of you contributed to it. Many of you lent your expertise or your ideas. We haven't done as good of a job incorporating plants into that as some other states, and there's some jurisdictional reasons for that. But there could be more collaboration. Even though Bill McAvoy is one of the great botanists in the entire country. But making sure that that's not just a plan on paper, but making sure that it's something that actually has sufficient resources for implementation is something that's an absolute top priority for me. And I'm trying to figure this out at the national level. we spend about $1 billion a year from the excise taxes for munitions and firearms and tackle and fishing tackle towards the Pittman-Robertson program and the sport fish restoration program, Dingle Johnson. And that's the money that we use to fund habitat conservation work across the country. It's one of the reasons why some of the hunted and kind of the game species, I hate that term, but the game species are doing relatively well in most parts of the country, where there's especially places where they've kind of thought through corridors and connectivity. We've never had the same level of resources for the full diversity of wildlife. And so we've been leading an effort the last few years called the Recovering America's Wildlife Act, which has got great bipartisan support. But the idea is pretty simple, to basically fund the states and territories and tribes to implement their state wildlife action plans, because through proactive, collaborative, voluntary work on the ground at the state level or at the tribal level, we can actually save thousands of species that are in trouble. Right now, in the case of Delaware, you have hundreds of species that are identified as species of greatest conservation need. We get a grant from the federal government. There's about $60 million, $70 million next year that are shared across the entire country to implement these state wildlife action plans. But in truth, the annual need is over 1.3 billion to implement those plans, across the entire country, from huge states like California or Alaska to smaller states like Delaware or Rhode Island. And so, but by having that level of investment, hopefully, supplemented by additional resources from the General Assembly, all of a sudden, though, we would be in a position to actually implement those plans at scale. And the thing that I love about that model is that when we've had resources, when we've had dedicated efforts, we've been pretty successful, right? I mean, you think about all the restoration projects we've been able to do along like the Bayshore, trying to restore habitat for horseshoe crabs and for red knots and dowitchers and the full range of shorebirds. You think about the collaboration we have with the state of Maryland many years ago, and still ongoing in some cases, around the fox squirrel, trying to better forest habitat as a way to help bring back the fox squirrel from being kind of on the precipice of extinction. The successes are there, and we've similar challenges now with salt marsh sparrows. There's a whole range of native plants that obviously need greater attention. But I'm confident that with the resources and with all of your talent, I mean the fact we have 100 people on this call right now shows how much interest there is. After a year of Zoom fatigue, the fact that you're all on this is a huge testament to the importance of the work and your passion for it. This is kind of the time to put those pieces together. And I've been kind of traveling the country virtually through Zoom in my little Pied Piper routine, trying to make the case simply that investments in restoration, investments in implementing state wildlife action plans, investments in natural resource, kind of natural defenses and natural infrastructure as a way to build resilience, trying as ways to restore degraded systems, whether that's forests that have been degraded because of pine bark beetles or drought conditions, wetlands that have been degraded either because of development or other types of pollution. A challenge that we've seen in abandoned mines in states that have those kind of extractive activities, or orphan wells. That cleaning up these resources is actually one of the greatest ways to address those 4 crises I led with at the top. That we could put millions of people to work. I mean, we actually estimate that we could probably do $200 billion worth of work across the country over the next 5 years to restore our natural systems at scale. And what that would do, I mean, the benefits are many, and I don't need to go through all of them, but you would end up employing about 700,000 additional people a year doing that work for 5 years, so about 3.5 million kind of job years over that time frame. You'd be able to sequester hundreds of millions of tons of carbon as they're trying to kind of get back on our kind of meeting our Paris commitments and going beyond, hopefully more like a 50% reduction over the next 10, 15 years. And you'd be able to engage a generation of young people to do the work. I've talked a lot about the Civilian Conservation Corps as a model as we're trying to come out of this recession. One thing that doesn't get as much attention is that young people, particularly young folks of color, have been disproportionately impacted in many ways because so many folks that are younger work in retail, they work in hospitality, they work in the service sector, and a lot of those jobs, frankly, just haven't come back at the same speed, given kind of the nature of the pandemic and the way restrictions were put in place and the like. And so what better way to restore kind of and heal our natural resources than creating economic opportunities, job opportunities, and hopefully careers for millions of young people across the country to actually do the work. I mean, so these are the kind of ideas that I would just encourage you to think about as you're kind of going through this great program today. That is, instead of thinking about investments and it's simply just as the outcome simply being protecting biodiversity, if we think about how it creates jobs, how it improves public safety, how it helps beautify and strengthens our our kind of outdoor recreation economy, all of a sudden we're in kind of a different playing field. You're not just kind of begging for scraps at the end of the bond bill process or the end of the JFC process, but all of a sudden you become part of the recovery strategy. And there's going to be a lot of money. I mean, I'm guessing that that the America Rescue Plan that was just passed by Congress the other day has about $1.9 billion in it. There's hundreds of millions of dollars that will come to Delaware in different forms. Most of that's going to be for direct assistance. I mean, a lot of that, there are some places where some of this work could make sense around job recovery, but the big opportunity is the next piece that's coming right after this, which is the infrastructure package. This is what they're going to call it, the American Recovery Plan. Apparently, we like these kind of three-word names. And President Biden, I love being able to say those words. President Biden is going to be announcing this in a few weeks, and it's going to be a $3 to $4 trillion package. And so, if you just think proportionally, like what that means for Delaware, if we just get kind of roughly our excuse me, we get roughly our kind of percentage. I mean, that's $10 billion of investment in infrastructure, and a big chunk of that, probably 5-6% of the overall package would be on the natural infrastructure side. That's real money. I mean, you think about the amount of work we were able to do together after Hurricane Sandy. You think about the amount of work we were able to do, when there were a few years where there were some additional resources in the bond bill, and that was $5-10 million here and there. I mean, in some cases, like the Prime Hook project, I think was $40 million. I mean, imagine, $10 billion going towards not just roads and bridges, but also our water systems, our and restoring all kinds of habitats that have been degraded, putting people to work, from Southbridge up in Wilmington, all the way down into Blades and places and Seaford, that place that have had water quality challenges, and everywhere in between. It's a transformative opportunity. But the only way we seize that opportunity is if we make sure that this work, and having the kind of the ecological integrity and kind of the foresight to think about making sure that if stems are going in the ground, right, that we're using native plants ecologically appropriate in the right places at the right time, and that does require a level of foresight and kind of thinking through it. And so I couldn't be more excited, because I think the way we come out of this incredibly challenged past year is a huge opportunity to kind of rethink the way that we interact with nature. The number of young families across the country that have turned to nature as a way to have that kind of serenity and solace and exercise and just sanity over the past year is something I don't think we're going to lose anytime soon. I mean, everyone on this call, I know most of you are kind of looking at the names. We're all true believers, right? We are the choir, right? We're the ones that are spending time in nature. We're doing the cleanups. We're doing the plantings. We're doing the invasive species eradication projects. There's a whole lot more folks, right, that are realizing what amazing resources we have. And I think how we keep folks engaged, so folks just don't go back to the way it was, but really figuring out opportunities for real partnerships, ways for folks to be engaged in a very tangible way, not just as donors for a nonprofit, but actual like volunteers and actual activity, creates all kinds of new opportunities to not just get work done, but to build a bigger constituency for conservation, which is something obviously that we've always needed more and more in Delaware, where we know that having a strong voice in Dover, or up in Wilmington, or in Georgetown, or in Dover, can make all the difference in the world, right? I mean, having a handful of folks being able to show up saying, look, this is important, that we want, not just Newcastle to prioritize native, but we want Levycourt too. We want Sussex County Council, which may be a slightly harder sell, but I think we could get there. That we want the state to prioritize this, that when we're spending money on these other big projects, when we're expanding major highways, or we're other big projects are going on, that the habitat quality of the restoration work or the mitigation projects really is reaching the highest bar. That's using the absolute best science. It's using the absolute most impactful native plants that are appropriate in different areas. Creates opportunities, and these great models. We're not starting from scratch. Like, we are really in a position to be the first state in this. And I don't know, it's interesting. I feel like 10, 15 years ago, 10 years ago, I'm starting to date myself, making the case for native plants was hard in some cases. And folks like, oh, they're expensive, oh, you can't find them, oh, we don't have the maintenance, oh, it's easier to just put in more Bermuda grass, like, we don't want to, milkweed's ugly. I mean, like, these kind of arguments that I would get from our team. Not from our team, but from folks we were trying to convince. I do think that evolution has changed. I think a lot of that's due to Doug Tallamy's work. and then many of the nonprofits. I think the politics are changing. I think the market's changing. I think just the awareness of the plight of so many species. And I think that the monarch in particular, when we're down 90% compared to 20, 30 years ago, and folks are realizing that, by simply having abundant kind of regionally appropriate milkweed is the way to help restore wildlife at scale, help restore the monarch population at scale, especially in that central flyway in the California flyway that's the most imperiled. It's both worrisome from an ecological standpoint, but it's also, I think it's also creates a cause for optimism, because it's something we can do, right? It's also something in many cases we don't need government to lead. We need government to be a partner. But planting milkweed, having regionally appropriate, not the tropical stuff, because a lot of times the migration stops if you plant kind of the wrong milkweed. But having that simple task of having milkweed, right, kind of in abundance, so we can make sure that the migration for monarchs carries all the way through Delaware. They're in their stepping stones of the majestic migration from Mexico to Canada. It's just a little thing. And I can't tell you what I watched on TV a couple of days ago. It's probably some Netflix garbage. But I can remember, Christ, I'm going to date myself. 35 years ago, in my backyard, in my parents' backyard, up in Syracuse, New York, reading Ranger Rick magazine, opening it up, seeing a story about the symbiotic relationship between milkweed and the monarch butterfly. There's a great map. I can still remember it today, years later, of like the migration, and then seeing that that part of upstate New York was significant on the map. And then going out trying to find native milkweed. We actually had to go to a couple places, a couple local nurseries, because not a lot of folks had it. Then planting it in the backyard, and then within a matter of weeks, and this had already been germinated. Kind of germinating that stuff can be tough, but planting in the backyard. But then in a few weeks, having monarchs on the milkweed that I planted. I mean, I was 5, and I can still remember like it was yesterday. And so those experiences can be replicated, across, and I think opportunities with schools, all academic institutions. And obviously, it was a pretty big harbinger, since the National Wildlife Federation publishes Ranger Rick. It's kind of a harbinger of things to come, I guess. My mom kind of saved absolutely every single issue of it. So when I was actually applying for this job, as a quick aside, she delivered boxes of banker boxes of all the Ranger Rick issues from the late 80s and early 90s. But the reason I bring it up, though, is that there is something transformative, right? There's something that as much as I care deeply about the biodiversity and making sure that we're kind of passing on the full diversity of plant and wildlife diversity for future generations. I do think it changes you. It changes the person that's involved in kind of the connections, particularly with kids, to understand how their actions are contributing to kind of the bigger circle of life. And this is why I'm so proud of the work of some of the nonprofits where engaging kids in this work, because I do think once you kind of get hooked at a young age, it does stay with you forever. And right now, there's about 60 million people across this country that plant that garden. About 60 million kind of, if you survey, right, it's about 20% say they actively garden. Of that, about 9 million of that 60 million say they actively garden for wildlife and have wildlife in mind. And so that's a lot of opportunity, right? I mean, I think we can get that 60 million number up also, but we could easily move that 9 million nationally to try to get to 30 million over the coming decades, just through awareness, making it easy to participate in these programs. And this is where Stephanie was very kind in the introduction, talking about all these different initiatives, as opposed to thinking of the work around native species and native plants as like a standalone initiative. Thinking about how it weaves into everything else we're doing. How does it weave into STEM education in the schools? How does it weave into the infrastructure projects that we have to move forward? How does it weave into efforts to reduce flooding in different places? How does it weave into all the different efforts that are out there trying to create new economic opportunities and job opportunities? So it becomes part of everything as opposed to a standalone by itself. There's real opportunities, right? There's real money. There's real pathways to make progress. And then all of a sudden we're not talking to 100 of us on a call that, as I said before, the true believers, but we're reaching a much broader audience, statewide. I mean, I'd love to be at a place in the coming years where, all the major, developers and landowners have this as a priority, because there's been so much public support, so much awareness, and so many great markets out there that they all decide to use, kind of native landscaping for their properties. I mean, I'd love to be in a place where we're never putting up another honey locust or ginkgo tree. We're using native oaks and other native plants, because we've kind of made the case that that's both what the public wants and kind of the consumer wants, and it also has all these other benefits. I think we can get there. I mean, I think we're actually at the point where we're kind of reaching a tipping point where folks are realizing that if we keep doing things the way we were, that a lot of the species that we care about are going to struggle. And when you start looking at numbers of more than 1/3 of all songbird of all songbird population, songbird species being their populations being in fairly rapid decline right now. I mean, the shorebird numbers are even worse. The grassland bird numbers are even worse than those. Those are pretty scary numbers, but kind of in that crisis, to kind of coin the cliche, there does lie an opportunity. So I couldn't be more excited about what you're all doing. I think there's huge opportunities. There's opportunities in the Delaware Bay, in the bayshore environment. There's obviously huge opportunities in inland bays. I think there's a lot of opportunities in the Chesapeake as well, for folks to kind of think by watershed in terms of species. I mean, it really is kind of connecting the dots. I think, I think we have an incredibly strong birding community in Delaware that's, just, I guess, it's just phenomenal. The Ornithological Society and ABA and just kind of great organizations, how we connect some of that to some of the smaller groups that are focused on herps or groups that are focused on kind of the full range of invertebrates, making sure we're thinking about these systems kind of in a more integrated way, because obviously they're all connected in a big way, but there's huge opportunities. And so I would just encourage all of you to really, really think big in the coming weeks, in the coming months, because I think there's gonna be opportunities in play. And because we have such a great champion in Senator Hansen and several of the new members really care about this too. I mean, I'm really excited about kind of the composition of the legislature. Governor Carney's been supportive. The DNREC team's been supportive. We can push them further because that's our job as advocates. But there's a huge opportunity, and so I would just encourage folks to lean in, make it a priority. We're happy to provide any resources, anything that I mentioned today. We're happy to give more background information about. But now is the time, and I would love to be able to, as I'm traveling the country, talking about places that are really leading the way to conserving not just a small segment of species, but really the full diversity of flora and fauna. I'd love to have Delaware be kind of first on the list because we have all the resources to do it. I think we just need to kind of take the next step and get to the next level. So with that, I know we got some additional time. I'm happy to answer questions for a little while, but and Stephanie, I'm not sure if I'm turning it back over to you. But again, it's an absolute honor to be with you, and I'm all in to do whatever I can to make sure that this commission is incredibly successful in the weeks and months ahead.
Thank you, Collin. Stephanie, would you like to say something?
No, I just wasn't sure if I was supposed to. I can always talk, but no, that's.
Yeah, talk. Well, Collin, thank you. I just wanted to thank you personally. I'm a little too old to have read Ranger Rick as a child. However, as soon as I got out of college, I took a job leading a Ranger Rick group for the city of Newark. So I did read a lot of them after that. Go ahead, Stephanie.
Oh, I would like to learn more about the civilian corps, like the Civilian Conservation Corps. Like what is the idea of that? Because what I have found, there are a lot of people. There are a lot of young people and just a lot of people that are volunteers. But the idea of making this a real program that we could use to help kind of economic development and coming out of COVID and moving forward with more of an environmentally conscious job creation and economy is something that's very interesting to me. And I want to know, I want to learn more about that. I like Collin, I'm very excited with the composition of our legislature coming up. And I think now is perhaps the time when we could get something like that done. So any more information about that is something that I'm going to be very interested in hearing.
No, thanks, Stephanie. I mean, I think it's a huge opportunity, and and we have like little pieces in Delaware, right? Like the we call it like Greenworks program, like in Wilmington, that and you've helped with over the years. There's different kind of cores that function, and then obviously all the AmeriCorps infrastructure. And the case that I was making, I'll put this thing in the chat. Just pulled it up. I was trying to make the case during the presidential campaign that this should be a top priority. And unfortunately, President Biden actually made it a kind of a plank of the campaign to bring back the CCC in a big way. He's calling it the Civilian Climate Corps. And then he had an executive order that he signed on the 27th of January, kind of directing the agencies to implement it. But the idea is quite simply that when we're doing natural resource restoration work and doing resilience work, let's make sure we're hiring as many young people as possible as part of it. We can do it in ways that have fair wages and have a lot of opportunities for making sure that it's equitable in hiring. And so Alana's decided to join us. Alana, say hi. Sorry, the beauties of COVID. Sorry. She wanted the screen to watch Octonauts for a few minutes. That there's a huge opportunity, and that frankly that kind of modernizing the AmeriCorps structure, combining then resources into states where states could actually do a lot of the work themselves. It doesn't have to be centrally done federally, because just to go back for a second, in the 1930s, I mean, the model was very much a centralized, almost military style, camps. Folks were basically put into like work camps where they're doing works in individual, national forests or national parks. We could decentralize it more. We could have folks that are working, with nonprofits. We could have folks that are working with the states or the counties or individual agencies. And the idea would be that you basically have folks either applying for projects and then getting kind of federal funding that way, or the states would just get block grants, and then they basically have to show for various purposes. But let's absolutely talk offline. The county's interested in doing some work as well. They have some resources to apply to it, and there's some good pieces. I mean, a lot of like DNS programs lend itself to it. Some of the stuff that DCH is doing lend itself to the work. So I think there's a huge opportunity to make the CCC model kind of real in Delaware, in a way that would, there's just plenty of work. We have no shortage of projects. So it's a way to kind of solve multiple problems at the same time.
Good. Well, we should definitely talk offline more about that. What has been your thought about, kind of forecasting EPA? So, we're, as are the state, elected officials and government. I know the federal government right now is very much concentrated on COVID and getting us out of this issue and pandemic that we're currently in. Have you heard anything with regard to EPA and like when we might expect to see a cabinet secretary there or the regional administrator so that we can begin working on some environmental issues at the federal level?
Yeah, so very excitingly, so last week, the secretary was, or I guess 2 weeks ago now, Michael Reagan, who's the new administrator, he's a good friend. He was the administrator down in North Carolina for a while. Was confirmed by the U.S. Senate. So we actually have a confirmed EPA administrator who believes in some science and actually believes in the mission of the agency. So that's exciting. He just took office. I think it was a week ago Friday, and his first line to the staff was like, science is back. That we're going to start trusting the experts again. Yesterday, he kind of reached out to all the states and wanted to talk about restoring the state-federal partnership, which had been eroded pretty badly in all directions. It wasn't a liberal conservative thing. It was kind of just across the board. The relationships had just been deteriorated over the 4 years. And so, I think you're going to see obviously a huge focus on climate and like the power sector, because Delaware's already, kind of cleaned up a lot of the power sector. We won't be as impacted as other places that have, more coal in their portfolio, because we had already worked to switch a lot of that over the past 10 years. But you're going to see a huge focus on water, huge focus on the Clean Water Act, clean water protections, the wetland protections, some headwater as well. Some of those protections that were put in place under President Obama, but then were kind of held up in the courts and then kind of proposed for repeal by the Trump administration. I think you're going to see a lot of focus on forever chemicals. So like PFAS will be a top priority. You're going to see some new rules coming out on that have been delayed. Other types of like toxic substances. I think there were some great reforms that Senator Carper and others worked on, Tom Udall and a few others worked on in 2015 and 2016 around the Toxic Substances Control Act on TSCA. Most of those had not been implemented. So like you're going to see a focus around chemical safety, which obviously presents a challenge in many parts of Delaware, just given some of the legacy pollution we have, why that the water work and other stuff that Denrick's doing is so important. But I think those are some of the major issues. I think the other thing you'll see is a huge focus on environmental justice, and frankly, it's overdue. EPA traditionally hasn't been as kind of laser focused on the communities most impacted, and not really, and hasn't had the tools to kind of think about cumulative impacts in a way that's really kind of more intersectional and more kind of forward thinking. And so, I think in Delaware, we've made some strides there, even though obviously we have a ways to go. I think we've done a better job on the investment side than maybe on the regulatory side. But I think you're going to see environmental justice investments and oversight be really strong, because I mean, a lot of the same, communities that are suffering the most from COVID, especially Black communities, but Black neighborhoods, or in some cases Latino or Indigenous communities, are also disproportionately affected by COVID, but also disproportionately facing historical pollution. And so, like, that intersection is something we have to address. I mean, we have to recognize the kind of the environmental racism that's gone into citing for a long time. And so I think you'll see EPA focus there. But Michael's great. I'm sure we'll get him to Delaware soon to meet everybody. You'll like him a lot, and he's building a pretty strong team.
I'm good. It's really good to hear, because so much of what we've been doing at the state level for years now is trying to anticipate what damage the federal government is going to do, so that we can quickly jump in and try to get a fix in place. And we've had to do that on a number of things. And there are two issues that are really kind of on deck right now that we're ready to jump on, because there had been problems in the past and we just weren't sure where to go. One of them is with regard to PFAS. So Representative Heffernan, she's the prime in the House and I'm the prime in the Senate. We're going to be asking DNREC to set a state level for PFAS, recognizing that this is a problem. It's really good to hear that the federal government is going to be focused on that too, because it's one of those class of emerging chemicals that is ubiquitous, and that we know that it has some environmental and human harm risk associated with it, but it just hasn't gotten the attention that it needed. So it's good to hear that that's coming up. I'm also really happy to hear that that there's going to be some focus on the Clean Water Act and the tidal wetlands issue, because one of the things that did happen is through executive order, the Trump administration rolled back on the non-tidal wetlands permitting program. And that's all that we had here in Delaware to protect, non-tidal wetlands. And so as a result, we have about 10,000 acres that are just really unprotected right now, as far as government and regulation and statute is concerned. It's unprotected. And I had been in conversations with the Department of Natural Resources about having the state take over that program. And we currently have a draft resolution looking into the state working with EPA and the Corps to come up with a state program. But, again, I recognize that's an expensive ticket. If the federal government is going to actually now come back to focus on this, should it be more of a collaboration? Because I know that, if I have to try to sell 10 to 12 new positions at DNREC to institute a new program that the federal government otherwise is going to do, I'm probably not going to get that passed. So there has to be some forecasting involved in what's likely to happen going forward. So I'm very, very happy to hear that the federal government is going to now go back and focus on wetlands and what to do. I'm still of the opinion that Delaware needs to do more with regard to what the previous federal wetlands program did. So there is still ground there that needs to be discussed. But the fact that we're not going to be doing the entire thing ourselves potentially is really very, very good news.
Yeah, and I think I tried to get kind of freshwater wetland protections in place when I was at DNREC, and I think the economy was bad, and the legislature wasn't nearly as progressive as it is right now, and there was more pushback. There's a perfect partnership opportunity where the feds play a bigger role and the state plays a bigger role. I think we could do a lot of it through a combination of kind of smart regulations, but also a bunch of incentives that complement those regulations. So we have a whole bunch of isolated wetlands that are incredibly important ecologically. Kind of I think they're tier 1 or 2. I can't get the title, the names in Delaware. Kind of every state kind of categorize things differently. But those top 2 classifications are kind of the really high quality stuff, right? Where we don't want the subdivision in Sussex. We don't want the trailer park. We don't want like the different kind of proposals that I feel like we're always kind of fend off one by one. And at the same time, I'm fine from both from an economic and a fairness point of view, figuring out if there's ways to help compensate folks for not developing those resources through some kind of tax credit structure, or using some money from the Open Space Council, or moving some resources from farmland preservation, or moving NACA or other federal programs to make those priorities. Because like you said, it's not an infinite number of acres, right? I mean, like the best of the best, like you said, is 10 to 12,000 acres. It's not, and they're not cheap acres, but the ecological value, especially in perpetuity, is massive. And so, I'd love to work with you on that. Matt Sarver and I've had some conversations too. I mean, he's been giving some good thinking to it. I just think there's now is the time. And frankly, I think there's a lot of folks that are realizing as you're seeing more extreme, weather, as you're seeing some flooding in some of these places, they're not safe to build on anyway, right? And just because they can doesn't mean folks should. And obviously some of those opportunities are going to be diminished as the federal rules get retightened again. So I think now is the time to have a thoughtful conversation. And it's also, I think, I think bringing folks in early and having a bigger set of kind of stakeholders in that conversation, because before it was very much a developer versus kind of environment conversation where there's many more folks that need to be part of that conversation. But I'd love to help you with it because I think now is the time, and I think we can make people whole and at the same time conserve these resources. Some of the Delaware, I mean, we have some resources that are just globally unique, right? That we need to protect, and it's going to take us to do it.
There was a question in the chat about what is PFAS. So do you want to take that one?
Sure. So there's a series of kind of man-made chemicals, and you'll hear these terms like PFAS, PFOA, PFOA, and so they're either per or polyfluoroalkyl substances, and so they've been manufactured, and some were actually kind of manufactured in Delaware, or by Delaware-based companies, and I think we're finally understanding the impacts, and so. In some cases, it was kind of a feedstock. In some cases, I mean, there's all kinds of uses like fire suppression. And one of the places that we're seeing a lot of the pollution is on in military installations or different kind of airports where folks were using it as a way to either prevent fires or kind of respond to fires. But it gets in the water, and it's like I said, it's a kind of a man-made forever chemical. The health impacts are better understood now than even a few years ago. But we got to clean it up. We got to remediate it because the impacts on human health and wildlife health are massive. And EPA was directed years ago to take steps. They kind of refused to under the Trump administration in any kind of significant way. And so you'll see it be a top priority. One of the things I'm excited about, my friend Michael, who's now the EPA administrator, is that he actually made this a priority in the state of North Carolina. And North Carolina was one of the states where there were a series of agreements that were made between the state agency and the companies because of the lack of federal involvement. And so he kind of gets the issue in a very personal way. But yeah, this is nasty stuff. This is nasty stuff that if we don't take care of, we'll have health consequences, particularly for kids for years to come.
Okay. Barbara asks over in the chat, who is in charge of the development process? Let's see, who's in charge of the development process, kind of overseeing that in the state. So I'll take part of that and you can chime in with that. Generally, the development process is under the jurisdiction of the 3 county administrations. So you have the specific development projects, which are all going to be under the approval process of the specific county councils, and then the implementation of those projects under the county administration. And the counties generally plan for what they're going to build, where, and how through their county comprehensive plan process. And so I think a number of the counties are going through that process right now. So you might want to look into that. The state does have the ability to pass legislation that will have a broad effect on development if you can get the legislation passed. And so that many times is where the hangup is. It's sometimes very difficult to get a regulation passed at the state level, an environmental regulation passed at the state level, because you have very different views about development from the 3 different counties. So, we have 62 legislators, many of whom live in Sussex County and Kent County. And they sometimes, particularly in Sussex County, feel very differently about development and property rights than they do in Newcastle County. And so that's why it's difficult sometimes, it's difficult almost all the time to get environmental legislation passed legislatively that affects development. Doesn't mean it can't be done, and I'm certain we're going to be looking at it. But it's historically been quite difficult to do. And I think that's probably what led to the difficulty in getting freshwater wetland or non-tidal wetland legislation put together or through the working group back, I think when Collin was just talking about, I think that was the 2014 era or time, when there was this huge effort to put together a working group and then potential legislation regarding freshwater wetlands. And it didn't work. Is that correct?
And the only thing I would add is that, I mean, as part of this commission and as part of like the broader community, there's there's incredible knowledge about kind of where are the places. I mean, like the seminal work on this was written by a brilliant kind of one of Delaware's leading conservation women, Lorraine Fleming. I don't know if Lorraine's on the call right now, but I mean, literally wrote the book on the most important places in Delaware. Like Delaware wildlands, under Kate Hackett's leadership, right, has been trying to protect the best of the best in different places. Obviously, TNC. I mean, I do think how we come together to try to identify those places, not just through the state processes, but also the county processes. And then I would encourage folks to think more and more about this, kind of the incentive side. I mean, we are showing up, I don't like this analogy, but we're kind of showing up with a knife to a gunfight in a lot of cases. But like the money to be made for development is so high, right? The return on investment is just so high that it's worth the risk to some of these folks. And we're seeing it right now up in Newcastle, like the Hercules development, right? I mean, you see these different places where like we need to have some green space, but at the same time, I don't necessarily agree, but I don't fault folks for turning a huge percentage profit on different projects. We're going to need better tools in some cases, and that means having right now the federal conservation easement process, for example, basically gives you the value of the land as a potential deduction, but you're only getting 30% of the value, if that, of the actual property, which is in some cases for folks that don't want to develop, like that's a great incentive. For folks that do want to develop, it doesn't really kind of cover the cost of the lost opportunity cost, if you would. And so and again, it's not cheap, but at the same time, this is one of the things, kind of that ounce of prevention and spending a little bit of money now, especially if you could phase over many years. Is a way to protect something in perpetuity, again, because once we lose it, right, it's kind of gone forever, or at least for the foreseeable century. And so I think those are the kind of conversations that folks are going to want to have, especially if we're going to be living in a reality where more folks are maybe telecommuting a little bit more. Folks are kind of choosing where they want to live first, as opposed to just being close to the job, because that's less important. I mean, these quality of life elements and like kind of the having intact ecosystems is going to be more and more important. As folks are deciding, whether they want to make Delaware their long-term home and what parts of the state they want to live in.
See, we have a question. What do the panelists think about the idea of eliminating the $50,000 cap on state tax credit on land donations and easement? I think that's certainly something that we need to talk about, because really it's the ability, it's money that's driving a lot of this, just as Collin had said. So yeah, I think that's a good idea.
And the only thing I would add is that there's ways to do it that are fiscally responsible too, right? You can eliminate the cap, but then spread it over more years, right? There's ways to not have it affect the bottom line for JFC, for the budget, but just being really thoughtful about it. The other thing too, and this gets more complicated, there's some folks that just don't have the tax liability. An older family that is land rich, but doesn't have a lot of income. Being able to transfer those credits easily to somebody that has the tax appetite, so then that value is still there. The federal program is a little easier than the state program. Actually, the Virginia model is actually pretty good. The Georgia model is pretty good too. But there's ways to make it economically advantageous to everybody. In a lot of cases, that's actually cheaper than having the Open Space Council buy everything, or having a nonprofit have to buy it and manage it. So there's some benefits to having more of a hybrid model. I don't know if you've heard of this, but there has recently been some collaboration between the U.S. Forest Service and the University of Delaware, in which they've been looking at the suburban forested areas to determine what actually exists there and what actually exists there with regard to invasive species versus native, and then any of the other kind of effects from that. And so this was actually research that they're just now putting together. They've come up with some preliminary papers on it. And what they found is that most of the urban forested areas now are about the size of a Best Buy parking lot. And they took a look at 50 of these throughout Delaware, Pennsylvania, and I think there was a handful down in North Carolina.
And when they went in and they actually did an inventory of everything that's in that forested area, from the trees to the plants to the soil, the whole thing, what they found was that about 60%, I think it was 59 exactly, percent of the stems that you see in these small forested areas are invasive species, which was a great surprise, because everyone knew that there was, you look into these small forested areas and you can see a lot of the multiflora rose and the autumn olive and that sort of thing. But to realize that 60% of what you're looking at generally are invasive species was a surprise. Another piece that they have put together, and they don't quite understand why it is, but also these areas have more ticks than areas that are not as invaded by invasive species. And those ticks have a higher percentage of actually carrying the vectors for Lyme disease. So we have, we have this situation where we want people to get outside, and we want them to become, take your kids outside. Just be really careful about going over to, the neighborhood forested area if it looks like there's a lot of brush there, because now, there's these higher incidence of Lyme disease. And so, I mean, they're thinking that perhaps it has to do with the fact that the small mammals that are there are generally going to be, for instance, like mice that are going to carry these particular types of ticks, as opposed to the areas where there's less invasive species, where there's perhaps more deer that don't carry these type of ticks. I mean, it's not a direct relationship for invasive species, more ticks, more Lyme, but it's, there are breadcrumbs along the way. I don't know if you have heard of any of that or not.
Yes, I knew the study was underway. I didn't know all the findings, which is both encouraging and horrific at the same time, because it shows that if we did a better job restoring natives, we could actually eliminate some of the other challenges. I think this is where I think a lot of us were conditioned to kind of lead with the ecological argument, right? That the symbiotic relationship, that the need for biodiversity from a moral and kind of ethical point of view is the argument. If the case to restore natives and remove invasives is public health, because we want less kids getting Lyme disease. That puts us in a whole different realm of funding. It puts us in a whole different realm of partnerships. I mean, I'd love to talk to Elena and the and Elena Deladon and others that have been focused on this issue for a long time. I mean, it just sets up different partnerships. And so, I mean, I'd love to talk about the specifics of this one. I'd also like to think about how it is an example of thinking of this work as having many more benefits than, now I don't want to say just for kind of biodiversity, but than just the ecological benefits. I mean, if we were able to reduce the number of incidents of Lyme disease by 10% in the state by focusing on more native and less and more in eradication of invasives, that's a pretty good outcome, right? Or 50% or 100, whatever the number is. So I just think the more that we're bringing the science to bear in other conversations, because most folks aren't thinking that, right? They're thinking, oh, it's all climate change because of warmer winters leading to less die-off among winter ticks and or deer ticks, and even even for me, it seems a little counterintuitive that it would make a huge difference on the tick population itself. But once you explain it, then it's like, oh yeah, that makes sense. There's a couple of breadcrumbs there that kind of come together. So I just think I would love to have this commission and all the partners that are part of it think about how we bring these arguments into other rooms. So we're not just kind of talking ourselves. I mean, Vikram had a good note, in the chat about, some of these studies. And I think, we don't, in many cases, especially due to thanks to Dr. Tallamy's work, we don't have a shortage of data, right? I think we need to figure out how to apply the data in different policy realms with different stakeholders, different partners in ways that are compelling. And, the case is pretty clean, but that's it's a good data point on the tick. So I will add that to the repertoire.
Yes, we have Ashley Kennedy, who's Ashley is, I think, one of our state's foremost tick experts. I believe she's with the Department of Natural Resources right now. She's been aware of the work. She says this is true. Black-legged ticks or deer ticks are strongly associated with Japanese barberry, multiflora rose, Amur honeysuckle, winter hollyberry, although winter hollyberry is a native.
Right.
and Asian bittersweet. Yep. Well, I think that's all of the questions that we have in the chat. We could give another couple of minutes or so if anybody wants to add anything in there. And Jim, is there anything that you wanted to bring up?
No, not at this time. I think Helen's going to say a few words about the rest of the day.
Okay.
So Helen.
Yeah, no, thanks, Jim. Let me say one last thing before Helen kind of moves us into the next program. There's a lot of power on this list. I mean, I was just kind of looking at it during as I started seeing who's on. I mean, I do think if there are ways to, kind of prioritize across, and actually beginning to build like a little more of a more structured work plan, right? Because I mean, there's things that are funding, right? There's things that are related to taxes. There's things that are related to procurement. There's things that are related to partnerships with other governments, whether that's federal or county, and in between. But I'd love to help with that because I just think the, if this constellation of, and I guess some of your government need to be careful about like the advocacy side, but I mean, for the folks that aren't, having a kind of a uniform playbook that folks are all working off of would be incredibly powerful. And obviously, DNS has been doing this work for a long time. Wildlands, I mean, like a lot of folks on this are doing their pieces. But I think the Delaware kind of conservation community is strongest when we're united. And I do think there's an opportunity right now, particularly as folks are trying to figure out where do we go from here, right? As folks are trying to figure out how do we come out of the pandemic, how do we address these public health challenges, how do we put people back to work? There's a moment in time. And so I would just encourage, the more granular and the more actionable the ideas are, the better. And I'm happy to help. I think this is incredibly important. And I think the time has finally arrived. So thanks for having me today.
Well, Jim, I think that if he would agree, maybe Collin could be a part of a brainstorming session with the Native Species Commission and others that we could talk about what are the next steps, where can we take this? Because that really was a big part of why we're doing this today, is to bring together these very high-powered, important experts in their field so that we can collaborate on many of these issues. This is precisely why we wanted to do this today.
And that's a wonderful segue.
Yeah, one second. That's true, Stephanie. And I think our last part of the series will be kind of kicking this off and trying to find ways to collaborate and get all these great people that are here today and others that aren't together. So great. Thanks, Collin. Helen.
I am so pleased how this morning has started. Senator Hansen, your update of legislation and the bill signing is exciting today. It sounds like there's great interest in the pollinator plates. I'm ready to put one on my car. Collin, you as well are always inspirational. The fact that 1/3 of our species are at heightened risk, you are correct. Delaware, we have the chance to do a bottoms up, to have people collaborate, dedicated experts. I love the fact of not only regulations, but incentives. There's lots of work to be done, but there's lots of energy with the people on this call and others that we can reach out to. And so with that, thank you both. There's more of the program today, but we are going to go on break until 11:15 when we will have this bill signing ceremony followed by Doug and then Jeff Downing talking about what's next. We have 2 sessions, but there's also a chance for people to give input, and today is being recorded. I know I will listen to it again because there are pieces that I want to take more notes on. And so with that, we will see everyone in a half hour.
And we'll start promptly also.
Yes. Collin, glad you're in another county this morning. And of our attendees today, we have all 3 counties represented. And I think that's so important in our state.
See you at 11:15.
All right.
Hello.
Hi, Doug. It's Helen.
Hello,
We
Helen.
We have just gone on break until 11:15 when the governor is due to arrive for the bill signing.
Okay, I didn't miss anything, did I?
Stephanie Hansen did a legislative update. Collin O'Mara just gave his keynote. It's recorded if you find that you want to listen to it later. And the link will go up on the DCH page. We'll also send out an email to everyone when it's available.
Okay, thanks.
And congratulations on your new book.
Thank you. Oh, this started at 9. Geez, I thought it started at 11. Huh. Okay.
Don't worry, you were mentioned many times, Doug. So.
I'm not worried.
You were there in spirit.
Actually, I am worried because I was mentioned many times.
All nice things.
All great things. Collin, I think we can get started. If that's all right. Okay, our next session, I think is a really special event, something that Delaware ecologists, landscape industry, and others have been waiting for a long time. The signing into law regulations that would prevent the sale of invasive alien species of plants in Delaware. To kick it off, I'd like to introduce a man that is not only my friend, but a friend of all Delawareans. He has also been a great supporter and leader in the conservation of our many state natural resources. John Carney is a Delawarean through and through. Like me, he was born and raised in Wilmington, Delaware. He has been a leader in our state for many years. He's represented Delaware for 6 years in the US Congress, 8 years as lieutenant governor, and is now in his second term as Delaware's governor. On a side note, I would personally like to thank John for his leadership during this last year's struggles with the COVID pandemic. The progress we have made fighting this pandemic is in large part due to the governor and his staff. It is my great pleasure to introduce the governor of the great state of Delaware, Governor John Carney.
Thank you very much, Jim. One of the things that's special about this bill signing that's part of your Zoom meeting today, session today, is that I have the opportunity during March Madness to be introduced by one of the best high school basketball players the state of Delaware has known, in Jim White. Most people know Jim today as a naturalist and a leader in preservation of our natural environments in our state. But once upon a time, he was the state basketball scoring leader back in either 71 or 72 for Salesianum school. And he and I played a little bit in the county league after that. Jim, it's great to be here with you during March Madness. Thanks for your leadership in these issues across our state for such a long time. We have 2 other leaders that I'm going to turn it over to, Senator Hansen and Representative Heffernan, who passed the legislation that established the Delaware Native Species Commission in the first instance, which is sponsoring today's session. I can tell you that I learned a lot through that legislation and took it to heart. And when I was planting new plants in the back of my house, I went to my neighbor, who's a naturalist working in the area, and he gave me a list of native species that I should plant, not the others that are maybe so popular in our state. But Senator Hansen has been an incredible leader in our Senate and in our community, a science-based leader, as has Representative Heffernan. And I'm going to turn it over to Senator Hansen to talk about this bill that we're going to sign today, Senate Bill number 22, which, as I understand it, is part of the work of the commission.
Thank you. Thank you, Governor. Yes, it is. You know, Senate Bill 22 is a substantive environmental bill that was passed unanimously by the General Assembly. Now, how many times can you actually say that? You know, it wasn't a resolution recognizing something important, but it was an actual substantive environmental bill that had bipartisan unanimous support in the Delaware General Assembly. And that's really saying something. And that really speaks to the leadership and the work that was done by so many people through the statewide Ecological Extinction Task Force and the Delaware Native Species Commission. It included our administrative agencies as well. This was a huge lift. And what it will do is it will ban the sale, export, distribution of about 37 or so invasive species in our state right now. This is not the entire list, but it's the list that we're starting with, and the list that will be updated periodically as we go forward by the Department of Agriculture. So I really want to thank my partners in this process that has taken a number of years to get through. We got COVIDed like so many things did last session, but we were able to get it through this session. And I really want to thank my co-sponsor, my House Prime sponsor, Deborah Heffernan. And Deborah has been with me, Representative Heffernan has been with me and in this effort since the beginning, since way back in 2017, as she and I were co-chairs of the statewide Ecological Extinction Task Force. And I have a great deal of respect for Deborah. She is currently the chair of the Environmental Committee in the Delaware House. She's the former president of the Brandywine School Board and an environmental toxicologist with more than 30 years of experience. And it shows. She is definitely a leader in our science community. So I will turn that over to my friend and colleague, Representative Deborah Heffernan.
Thank you very much, Senator Hansen. I think we are President and Vice President of the Mutual Admiration Society. I am very happy that SB 22 passed not only unanimously in the Senate, but the House. This bill is really going to work to make sure that our natural environment of Delaware stays natural and that invasive species don't take over and take over our state and definitely our environment. So thank you very much, everyone, for being there. And yes, we have started this goal with the Natural Species Commission together, and I applaud you for your leadership, Stephanie.
Thank you. Our next speaker that we will hear from is really kind of the originator of all of this. And that is our Professor Doug Tallamy. Doug Tallamy and the work that he and his graduate students have done at the University of Delaware to highlight the issue that we've had of our loss of our native species has been just tremendously important. It's really what sparked the initiation of the legislation that became the statewide Ecological Extinction Task Force and the Delaware Native Species Commission. The Bible that brought all that together is his book, Bringing Nature Home, which is the first. And you'll see I've got tabs. It is tabbed throughout here, so I use this all the time. Dr. Tallamy is a professor at the University of Delaware in the Department of Entomology and Wildlife Ecology, where he has authored 80 research articles and has taught insect taxonomy, behavioral ecology, humans and nature, and other courses for 32 years. Chief among his research goals is to better understand the many ways insects interact with plants and how such interactions determine the diversity of animal communities. So with that, I will turn it over to Professor Doug Tallamy.
Thank you, Stephanie. I've got to get you an up-to-date CV. It's been over 40 years now, but time moves on. I'm not going to say much now because I'm going to talk to you for a whole hour in a few minutes, but I just want to focus on the ecological value of this legislation, because it's easy to, there's a lot of nuances in here. The value of the legislation stems from the realization that invasive plants, and by definition, invasive plants are non-natives, destroy habitat. And throughout the world, there's a ton of data that shows that the loss of habitat is the #1 cause of the loss of biodiversity, which is a huge problem globally. The problem is it's been a hard sell to convince people that we've actually lost habitat, because you can drive around and it looks green out there. You see plants that looks like habitat. The problem is that a lot of people think they've got a misconception of the definition of what habitat is. They think it's a place to live, and it is a place to live, but it's also the food that is required to live in that place. And that's where invasive plants cause great problems, because they create places to live that have no food in them, because invasive plants do not support the insects that are the basis of the food webs that really support the animal diversity in our wildlife. So the places look green, but they're actually ecological dead zones. Why do invasive plants destroy food webs? That's what we're going to talk about in the next hour. But we're in the middle of the 6th great extinction. And that's the 6th great extinction that this earth has ever experienced. That's more than just a headline. It's something that will really come back and bite us in the future. So it's something we have to fight against and prevent. We can't prevent all of it, but we can minimize it. And that's exactly what this legislation does. So I didn't realize it was passed unanimously. That's really says a lot. And this may be the only state in the union that would do that. So congratulations to everybody who made that happen.
I think I am muted.
No, we can hear you.
Oh, you can hear me fine? Well, thank you very much for sharing. So it is an incredible achievement to have any piece of legislation passed unanimously in a General Assembly, and that speaks well of these two sponsors who I'm sure dazzled their colleagues with their knowledge, much of which has come from each of you. We're also joined here by Helen Fischel, who I understand is moderating today's Zoom, and the education coordinator, and Jeff Downing from the Mount Cuba organization. If you'd like to add a few remarks before I sign the bill, you're welcome to do that now. Helen?
Thank you, Governor Carney. I would like to say that with my 40-year career working with children in the environment, that I'm so pleased that this bill is being signed, and we will have the task ahead of us to educate others about invasives and what they can plant as a substitution. I look forward to you signing the bill and making it official. Jeff?
All I would add is just that Mount Cuba Center was founded by Lamont and Pamela Copeland with the specific intention of promoting ecological health and healthy habitats. And this legislation, it goes such a long way towards promoting those efforts and making them more tangibly real for the state of Delaware. I couldn't be more excited to see this being signed into law right now. So congratulations, Senator Hansen, Senator Heffernan, and we look forward to great things going forward. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Thanks for the great work that Mount Cuba does here in our state, and with your reputation beyond the state borders. Again, many thanks to Senator Hansen and Representative Heffernan and their colleagues for taking the science of others on the call, on the Zoom here, converting it into Senate Bill number 22, which it's my privilege to sign, which will go a long way towards protecting and preserving biodiversity here in the state of Delaware. And we appreciate all of you on the Zoom and your presence today for this Zoom conference. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Governor. Thank you very much. Good to see you again, John.
To see you, Jim. Everybody who's participating today for your great work for our wonderful state.
And John, you reminded me, happy St. Patty's Day to everybody.
I got my St. Patty's Day.
I know. Great.
It's St. Patty's Day is always an indication that spring is right around the corner.
That's great.
Thank you all.
Take care. Stephanie, I believe you will introduce Doug.
Jim, before we begin, there's one final piece. Gordon, will you cue up? We have a short video message from the volunteer group that works at the Judge Morris Estate. This is a group of university students as well as Charter School of Wilmington students, and they recorded a message for us.
Hey! Ho! Ho! Invasive plants have got to go! Hey! Ho! Ho! Invasive plants have got to go!
The Native Species Initiative is a service-based organization that aims to bridge the gap between University of Delaware and Newark Charter School student volunteers and ongoing invasive plant removal through the Judge Morris Environmental Stewardship Group. Through our work, we have learned how to identify local natives and invasives, as well as practice safe removal techniques. We're really excited about the passage of Senate Bill 22 for raising awareness about the issues surrounding invasive plants and for banning their sale.
Hi, my name is Lily Peterson. I'm a junior at the University of Delaware. I've been coming out to Judge Morris since June of 2020. I love being out here, getting some fresh air and pulling invasives with my friends, learning about the forest. My favorite native plant is the dogwood.
So my name is Avery Young and I'm a senior at Newark Charter High School. I have been coming to Weeding every Thursday and Sunday since July of 2020, and I've been inviting a lot of my friends to come with me, and it's been a great way to hang out in a socially distant fashion as well as help out the environment. I would also say my favorite native plant would be the spice bush.
Hi, I'm Sophie Maratznik. I've been coming to Judge Morris since early June doing invasive plant removal. My favorite part about doing this is I'm a wildlife and insect major, so I never really get to learn about plants in the classroom, but they're a really big part of the ecosystem. So here I get to learn more about like IDing them and the way invasive plants work. I think that's really cool. My favorite native plant is the honey locust.
Thank you, Senator Bill 22, Plant Natives!
And with that, I'd like to introduce Doug. Stephanie gave a brief introduction of Doug. We all know that he is a professor, researcher, author, and we can claim him here in Delaware, although he's a Pennsylvania resident because of the University of Delaware. He has authored Bringing Nature Home in 2008, which won the Silver Medal Award by the Gardeners Writing Association. The Living Landscape, which he co-authored with Rick Dark, was published in 2014. Nature's Best Hope in 2020, and the brand new Nature of Oaks, which has just come out. He has won many awards. We really have been very fortunate today. The panel of speakers are my all-time favorites. You won't be disappointed. And I think that one of Doug's most recent quotes that I actually have posted to remind me of why we're all doing this is, in the past, we have asked one thing of our gardens, that they are pretty. Now they have to support life, sequester carbon, feed pollinators, and manage water. And with that, Doug, we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Helen. And Jim, if you're still there, I didn't know you were a basketball star. You should have told me. All right. I want to talk today about my idea of what Nature's Best Hope is. But before I do that, I want to return to what happened not this fall, but a year ago fall. We had what we call an oak mast up and down the East Coast. In the Red Oak group, members of the Red Oak group all got together and decided to make their acorns at the same time. And this is what it looked like in a lot of places. Well, I'm easily entertained, so I took one of those acorns and I just stared at it. But I was rewarded because an insect started to chew its way out of the acorn. First, it chewed a hole about the size of its head, and then it forced its head through. Then it forced the rest of its body through. Tight squeeze, looked like the Pillsbury's doughboy there. Plop down. And it's a very dangerous time for this insect larva because it is good to eat. A lot of things are after it. So it gets to safety by wiggling and squirming below the surface of the soil. It takes about 30 seconds. And once it's under the ground, it stretches in all directions and forms a little chamber. And within that chamber converts itself to a pupa and stays there for 2 years. After 2 years, comes out as an acorn weevil. That's what an acorn weevil looks like. They have, looks like a long nose, but it's actually an extension of the head capsule, and the mouth parts are at the bottom of that extension. And they take those mouth parts and chew a hole down into the center of the acorn, turn around and lay an egg in that hole, and that's how the larva gets into the center of the acorn. Now you might wonder why they spend 2 years underground. Why don't they come out the very next year? Well, it takes red oak acorns 18 months to complete their development. So if they came out the next year, there wouldn't be enough acorns for them. But that, of course, leaves a hole in the acorn, a true vacuum, and you know that nature abhors a vacuum. And in this case, she has filled it with 3 species of temnothorax ants, tiny little ants where the entire colony lives in the vacated holes made by acorn weevils in acorns. And if they discover a brand new acorn, they get excited because their old acorn's falling apart. So they tell everybody, time to move. And they get busy. They grab the larvae and the eggs, and it takes about 30 minutes to move into the brand new acorn. After they do, they post a guard, make sure nobody else comes in, and then they will live in this acorn for the next 2 years until it falls apart. Well, about this time, my wife says, "What's your point? What are you trying to tell us?" I'm trying to tell you that that is just one of literally millions of very specialized interactions that comprise most of nature. This is another one, the relationship between jays and oaks. Jays are the primary dispersers of oak acorns. They will take an acorn and fly some distance, sometimes as far as 2 miles from the parent tree. Then they tap it below the surface of the ground. The idea is that they'll go in the wintertime and find it and have something to eat. But a single jay can bury 4,500 acorns in the fall. And they forget where they put a lot of them. So they can plant up to 3,000 oak trees every single fall. Very valuable service to those oak trees. You won't have breeding pileated woodpeckers unless you have lots of carpenter ants, because that's what they rear their young on. And you won't have carpenter ants unless you have the big trees that make those carpenter ants. You won't have this bee, Andrena facilii, unless you have this plant, Facilia. That is the only pollen that bee can rear its young on. And pollen specialization is very common in our native bees. We have about 4,000 species of native bees, and over 1/3 of them require the pollen of particular plants. You won't have Baltimore checker spots unless you have white turtlehead. Nature really is a series of very specialized relationships. The problem today, though, is that these relationships, nature itself, is on the ropes. And it's on the ropes because we did not take Teddy Roosevelt's advice. Way back in 1908, Teddy heard that the state of Arizona was going to mine the Grand Canyon. So he went to the canyon, looked out over the edge, and he said, "Leave it as it is." And with those 5 words, he started the process of creating the Grand Canyon National Park. The problem, of course, is that today we can't leave things as they were because we didn't. There's only about 5% of the lower 48 states that's anything close to its original pristine ecological condition. And that's because we've logged the country repeatedly. We've tilled it, we've drained it, we've grazed it. We've got 770 million acres of rangeland in this country, which is 4.5 times the size of Texas. And of course, we've paved it or otherwise developed it. We've straightened our rivers and dammed them, and you can spell that any way you want. We have polluted our skies and changed our climate for centuries to come. We have drained our aquifers. We've introduced more than 3,300 species of plants from other continents, and those are the invasive species we're talking about today. Many of them have escaped and are creating havoc in our natural areas. So in short, we've carved up the natural world into tiny remnants of its former self. And each one of those remnants is too small and too isolated from other such remnants to sustain the species that run the ecosystems that we all depend on. Why have we done that? Well, I guess we thought the earth was so big, our nest was so big, we could foul it forever and there wouldn't be any consequences. But of course, we were wrong about that. And that's why we're seeing very, very frightening headlines like this. The insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Talking about global insect decline, followed by this one. North America's lost 3 billion birds in the last 50 years. That's 1/3 of our North American bird population gone. Now the UN says, we're going to lose 1 million species to extinction, probably in the next 20 years. And I love the way they report these headlines, as if, I mean, they might as well say we're going to lose oxygen in the next 20 years and then move on to the next headline. This is not an option, folks. We cannot lose 1 million species, just like we can't lose our oxygen. So I go on talking about the pox that we humans have delivered upon the environment, thus upon all of our houses, but that is not what this talk is about. This talk is about a cure for that pox. And it's a cure that's going to take small efforts from lots of people, but those efforts will deliver enormous physical, psychological, and environmental benefits to everybody. Let's return briefly to this headline. The insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Well, E.O. Wilson, Harvard emeritus, the greatest entomologist of all times for sure, one of the greatest biologists ever, told us what it would mean if we lost our insects. And he did it way back in 1987. And this paper is the little thing that, the little things that run the world. And his message was very clear. Life as we know it depends on insects. And if they were to disappear, so would most of our flowering plants. And if most of our flowering plants disappeared, that would so drastically change energy flow through our terrestrial habitats that the food webs that support our animals, the amphibians, the reptiles, the birds, and the mammals, and even many of our freshwater fish, those food webs would collapse and all those animals would disappear. The biosphere, the living portion of the earth, would rot because we would have lost insect decomposers that right now rapidly turn over nutrients, and all we would have is bacteria and fungi. And humans wouldn't survive any of those drastic changes. The good news is that doesn't have to happen. We can save our insects, we can save our birds, we can save nature itself, but we're going to have to change the way we landscape in order to do it. Why is that? Well, remember, humans are products of nature. We are totally dependent on the natural world. We're dependent on what we call ecosystem services produced by healthy, vibrant ecosystems. Here are some of the things that plants produce for us and everything else, by the way. Oxygen, pretty important. Clean water, equally important. Carbon capture, enormously important today. Plants are pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, taking the carbon out of that molecule and building their tissues out of it, and then pumping the extra carbon into the ground through their roots. Our soils are brown or black because of the carbon that plant roots have deposited there over the eons. As a matter of fact, our soil scientists now tell us that the Earth's soils can sequester up to 7 times the amount of carbon that's in the atmosphere right now. All we have to do is get it into the ground. What's doing that? Plants. They build topsoil, they hold it in place, they prevent floods, they dampen severe weather, and lots of other important things. What do animals do for plants? Well, they provide pest control services. They pollinate nearly 90% of our flowering plants. They disperse plant seeds and other things. So designing landscapes like this that destroy the production of ecosystem services is simply not an option these days. You know, it never was a good idea, but today it's just a terrible idea. Because we need so many ecosystem services. We've got 7.8, 7.9 billion people on the planet. We need more ecosystem services today than ever before. We can't afford to waste huge parts of the earth with these types of status symbols. There have been visionaries through the ages who have recognized that we humans needed to work on our relationship with planet Earth. And Aldo Leopold was one of the most eloquent. He wrote extensively in the first half of the 1900s. One of the things he said is that the oldest task in human history is to live on a piece of land without spoiling it. Now, there have been indigenous groups have been good at doing that, but by and large, our huge Western societies and our huge Asian societies have been terrible at doing that. We habitually take more from the earth than it has to offer, completely wrecking an area, moving to the next area, doing the same thing. And Aldo knew that that certainly was not a sustainable relationship with the earth. So he developed an idea he called the land ethic. You know, he knew the humans had to use the earth. We had to farm it and lumber and graze and mine and do all those things. But he believed that we could learn how to do those things gently without destroying local ecosystems. And that's what he called a land ethic. And he wrote about that in the Sand County Almanac. What he didn't talk about was actually developing a land ethic where we lived. And I'm not sure why that was, but I suspect the notion that humans and nature cannot coexist in the same place at the same time was so deeply embedded in the culture of Aldo Leopold's day. It's still embedded in our own culture, that he may not have recognized it as an option. Today, I'm going to argue, though, that that living with nature not only is an option, is now the only viable option that's left to us. In the past, conservationists worked almost exclusively where there weren't a lot of people. We now need to turn that on its head. We now need to save nature, actually recreate it where there are a lot of people, because that's most places. In other words, we have to find ways for nature to thrive in human-dominated landscapes, not hang on by a thread, but thrive. Where are we going to start? Well, let's go back to private property. Most of the US is privately owned. That's 75% of the entire country. 85.6% of the land east of the Mississippi is privately owned. If we don't do conservation on private property, we're going to fail because we won't be working on large enough pieces of real estate. Now, when I talk about conservation, I'm really talking about rebuilding nature in places where we've dismantled it. Rebuilding functional ecosystems, but not all species contribute to ecosystem function equally. So we have to start with the building blocks, and then other species that depend on those building blocks will join in. And there's two groups that we can't do without. We talked about those flowering plants that are capturing energy from the sun and turning it into food. Well, you won't have those plants unless you have the pollinators that allow those plants to reproduce. But once the plants create food, capture the energy from the sun and turn it into food in their leaves, we have to get that food from the leaves to animals, or we don't have the animals. And then you have failed food webs and collapsed ecosystems. Most vertebrates do not eat plants directly. They eat something that ate plants, and that something typically is insects. And it turns out that caterpillars are transferring more energy from plants to other animals than any other type of plant eater. So if we design landscapes that do not have enough caterpillars in them, most of the energy is going to remain locked up in plant leaves, and we will have failed food webs and failed ecosystems. Let me give you an example from the Carolina chickadee. We have quite a bit of data on Carolina chickadees. They're the birds at our feeders right now eating seeds. So many of us make the mistake of thinking that that's all chickadees need. And if we put seed in our feeder, we're done. Well, 50% of their diet in the wintertime is seeds. The other 50% is insects. But when it comes time to reproduce, their babies can't eat seeds. So they have to rely entirely on insects. And if they are in a healthy environment, they will rear their young exclusively on caterpillars. So not just any insect, but caterpillars. And it turns out that they are not exceptions. 96% of our terrestrial birds are rearing their young on insects, and most of those insects are caterpillars. How do I know that? There's a number of lines of evidence that suggest that, but this is a citizen science project that Ashley Kennedy recently completed for her PhD in my lab. She put out a call for citizen scientists to take pictures of birds during the breeding season when they were carrying food to the nest. And they're going to send the pictures to Ashley. She's going to identify the prey items that were in the bird beaks and then reconstruct the nestling diet for as many birds in this country as she could. And she got thousands of pictures from all over the country and was able to reconstruct the nestling diet for 20 of the common bird families. And that's what you're looking at here. The green bars are the percentage of those nestling diets that were caterpillars. And in 16 out of the 20 bird families, caterpillars dominated the diet. So again, imagine what would happen if we design landscapes that don't have enough caterpillars in them. 16 out of the 20 common bird families would not be able to reproduce. So what's special about caterpillars? There's actually a number of things special. One of them is that they're soft. They're relatively soft prey items. Think of this guy as if he's a little sausage with a very thin wrapper. The thin wrapper is exoskeleton, it's cuticle made of chitin. It is undigestible. So the birds don't want a lot of that. And because they're soft, you can stuff that caterpillar down the throat of your offspring without fear of injuring it. And if you've ever watched a parent bird rear their young, they're pretty rough. They take that beak, it's like a plunger. They just stuff it down there. Caterpillars are also relatively large prey items. One medium-sized caterpillar is equal to the biomass of 200 aphids. Now, some of our smaller birds do chase aphids around, but do you want to chase 200 aphids or get one caterpillar? They're nutritious. They're very high in fat, very high in protein. Low percentage of chitin compared to most other insects, particularly beetles. Beetles are not like little sausages. They're like little tanks. And so much of a beetle is undigestible, and they also have lots of sharp edges. And finally, caterpillars turn out to be the best source of carotenoids for birds during the breeding season. Now, I mentioned carotenoids not because I love organic chemistry, but because I'm a vertebrate, and you're a vertebrate, and birds are vertebrates. And vertebrates cannot make their own carotenoids. Only plants make carotenoids. So vertebrates have to get their carotenoids from plants, and they have to get them from plants because carotenoids are essential components of vertebrate diets. And that's why my wife Cindy makes sure I have lots of carrots, so I get my beta carotene, and lots of tomatoes, so I get my lycopene, lots of whatever that is, so I get my lutein. And when I eat those things, it stimulates my immune system. I can't think of a better time to have a very healthy immune system. Carotenoids are antioxidants. They run around our bodies and protect our DNA from oxidative damage. They improve color vision. When your mother said, eat your carrots, you will see better, she was right. She didn't know she was right, but it turns out she was right. They improve sperm vitality, improve sexual attractiveness. Now we're talking about things like this male prothonotary warbler, who is bright yellow because he's had access to lots of luteins. He takes those luteins and makes pigments out of them, puts them in his feathers. And the brighter yellow he is, the more ladies he attracts. Where are the birds getting their carotenoids from? From the invertebrates that they eat. But as you can see, carotenoid content is not equally distributed among among bird prey items. The first two bars here are types of caterpillars. They have far more carotenoids than other types of bird prey. The third bar is orthopteroids, things like crickets, grasshoppers, and katydids. Here are the adult caterpillars down here, the moths and butterflies themselves. Far fewer carotenoids because they're not eating the green leaves. It's their caterpillars that eat the green leaves. And here's the earthworm way over here. So the early bird gets the worm, but he doesn't get any carotenoids when he gets the worm. So it's really starting to look like caterpillars are not optional parts of bird diets. It's looking like they are essential parts of bird diets. So let's just say birds need caterpillars. The next question is, how many do they need? Is 1 or 2 enough, or 1 or 2 a day enough? Let's go back to chickadees, because again, a lot of data with chickadees. How many caterpillars does it take to make a clutch of chickadees? 1 or 2 is not enough. It takes thousands, 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to make 1 clutch of chickadees, just to get them to the point where they fledge, where they leave the nest. And after they leave the nest, the parents continue to feed them caterpillars for another 21 days, but they're flying all around and nobody can count them. But you're talking about tens of thousands of caterpillars to make 1 clutch of a bird that's 1/3 of an ounce. And if you want chickadees to breed in your yard, you have to have those caterpillars in your yard. And we do want them to breed in our yards because in so many places, there's no other place for them to breed. Why do we need those caterpillars in our yard? Because the chickadees forage about 50 meters from the nest. They're not flying 5 miles down the road to the nearest woodlot. And if we don't design landscapes that has that many caterpillars, then we don't have breeding birds, that's linking insect decline to bird decline. And there's more and more evidence that that is one of the major causes of the bird declines that we're hearing about. We went to the original data set from Rosenberg et al. They're the group that said we've lost 3 billion birds in the last 50 years. And we divided the terrestrial birds into 2 groups, the species that require insects at some part of their life history and the species that don't. Like doves and finches can actually reproduce on seeds alone. They actually gained a few numbers in the last 50 years, but the birds that require insects on average lost 10 million individuals per species. This doesn't prove cause and effect, but it certainly does suggest that as insect population goes, so go our birds. Which means we really need to consider creating landscapes that have a lot of caterpillars in them, or otherwise they're going to be sterile landscapes. That's a new goal for landscaping, because in the past we have viewed our plants simply as decorations and we didn't want anything to eat them. And we've been good at keeping things from eating them. But now we need a new goal, and that is to add caterpillars to our landscapes. How do we do that? Well, you do that by adding the plants that make those caterpillars. Seems easy enough, but there is a catch, and that is that most plants don't make a lot of caterpillars. So we have to be fussy about which plants we're going to choose to put in our landscapes if we want to succeed. And we have to be fussy because the caterpillars that we're trying to support are very fussy about what they eat. And nothing illustrates it better than the monarch butterfly. You can have all the calorie pear and all the boxwood and all the camellias and crepe myrtles and burning bushes and barberries, all the things that we bring in from Asia as ornamentals in your yard, and you won't support a single monarch butterfly because the only thing they're going to reproduce on is milkweed. That's called host plant specialization. And it turns out that most milkweeds or monarchs are not exceptions. Most of the insects that are eating plants are just as specialized on particular plants as monarchs are, because plants have made them that way. Plants don't want to be eaten. They want to capture the energy from the sun and use it for their own growth and reproduction. So they've loaded their leaves with nasty tasting chemicals, secondary metabolic compounds that make those leaves either bitter or downright toxic. And it's a really effective defense that keeps most of the insects of the world from eating most of the plants of the world. And that's why it's green out there in the summertime. It's not because there are no insects out there that want to eat those plants. It's because most of the insects that are out there cannot eat most of the plants. But we do know that insects eat plants. So how do they do that? How do they get around those chemical defenses? Well, this is where the specialization comes in. Every plant lineage that's out there protects itself with a unique cocktail of chemical defenses. And a single insect species can't adapt to all of them. It's just too many things to adapt to. So they pick one or two and they get really good at getting around those particular defenses. They develop the particular enzymes that store and excrete and detoxify those compounds, the behavioral adaptations and life history adaptations that minimize their exposure to those compounds. But two important things here: it takes a long period of exposure to those plant lineages for all these adaptations to fall into place. That doesn't happen overnight. And because they get good at getting around the defenses of particular plants, they haven't spent any time adapting to the other plants, which locks them into what they've focused on, which means they can't eat anything else. And that's why when we bring in plants from other continents, whether they escape from our gardens into our natural areas, this is White Clay Creek State Park, by the way, every green bit of green you see there is an invasive plant. Or whether they don't escape, even if they stay in our yards, there's still plants from other continents that our insects have not adapted to. They are unable to eat those plants, which means it's a dead-end food web. About 30% of the vegetation in our natural areas now are invasive plants from Asia. And that's why we have this important legislation signed today. All I'm trying to say is that plant choice matters when we're trying to protect our natural areas or rebuild them. We have to choose the plants that are going to be able to do that. And I'm going to give you 3 examples of how well it works when we do carefully select our plants. And I'm going to start with our house right here in Oxford, Pennsylvania. We have 10 acres of an old farm that was broken up not long ago. Very old farm. It was farmed for about 300 years. The soil was exhausted. The last thing they did was mow the area for hay. But when you mow this area for hay, what you're really mowing is all the rootstocks of those invasive plants, the multiflora rose and the Oriental bittersweet and the Japanese honeysuckle, the autumn olive, the porcelain berry, and all that stuff. Then you mow that and call that hay. So of course, when we built the house, they stopped mowing, and that's what came back. The entire 10 acres was a mass of invasive vines. That's Cindy. She's getting ready to clear all this stuff, which she has done. So if you have a serious problem from invasive plants, don't give up. You can, it seems impossible, but you can get ahead of it. And I can say that with confidence because little old Cindy did it. What was I doing while she was clearing the property? I was telling her she was doing a great job, but I also was putting plants back. The idea was to rebuild the biodiversity at our house, turn it from a woodlot like you'd see in Beijing to one that actually belongs in southern Pennsylvania. So the first thing I wanted to do was to rebuild that caterpillar population. That's what's supporting the food web. And in order to do that, I had to have the plants that support those caterpillars. So wanted to see if I could get the Canadian owlet on our property. And I'd never even seen a Canadian owlet before, but first I had to attract the adults. That's what they look like, just like leaves. But in order to have Canadian owlets, you have to have the plants that they eat. They are specialists on meadow rue. We didn't have any meadow rue. I'm sure there was meadow rue here before the farming started, but it was long, long gone. I don't know of any meadow rue anywhere around here. So I got some meadow rue seeds from someplace and planted them. And then I really didn't, this was the beginning. And I was not convinced at all that the Canadian owlets would actually be able to find my little patch of meadow rue. So I didn't go out and check it. It was about a month and a half after I planted it. It grew really nicely, but finally I walked by and I was very surprised to see that it was almost defoliated by Canadian owlets. They had found it right away, and I was amazed about that. So it was a great success. Now we have a good population of meadow rue and a good population of Canadian owlets, which means we've added 2 species to the property. Same story with the goldenrod stowaway. That's a misnomer. This beautiful moth has nothing to do with goldenrod. It's a specialist on Biden's aristosa, ditch daisy. Now, I did know where there was some Bidens in a power line cut in Bear, Delaware. So I got some seeds, planted them in our house. They grew very nicely. Took about a year for the moth to find our Bidens, but they have found it. Both are doing well. So now we've added 4 species to the property. Wanted the hackberry emperor, not because it's the most beautiful butterfly, but because it's a butterfly that ought to be here. But as its name suggests, it's a specialist on hackberry. We didn't have any hackberry, so I planted hackberry. We had to wait 4 years for the butterflies to find it, but they did. I walked by one of my hackberry trees this past June, and there were 9 hackberry emperor caterpillars on a single branch. So another big success. So now we've added 6 species, and this is how it goes. We did not plant goldenrod. It came in on its own, and along with it came many of the things that eat goldenrod, like the beautiful brown-hooded owlet, the Arcigera flower moth, the goldenrod leaf miner, the distinct Sparaginothus, the goldenrod gall moth. This is one that hasn't come yet, the goldenrod flower moth. I don't know why it hasn't come yet, but it hasn't. So this is anticipation. This is part of the fun. It's like waiting for the ketchup to come out of the bottle. Every year I go out and I check my goldenrod trying to find these caterpillars. One of these years I will, and that'll be a great day. Planted Virginia creeper. Yes, Virginia creeper. A lot of people don't like it. I don't know why. It's got good fall color. It's an excellent pollinator plant, by the way, even though the flowers are little green things. They're not pretty to us, but the bees love them. It produces great berries for the birds in the fall. They're very high in fat, and it can climb our trees without girdling them, without strangling them. It's a good ground cover, and it's the major host plant for many of our large sphinx moths, which are the major source of food for breeding cardinals. Things like the Pandora Sphinx and its beautiful adult, the lettered sphinx, the hog sphinx, the abbot sphinx, all on Virginia creeper. Want to see if I get the double tooth prominent just because it's such a cool looking caterpillar. Well, it's an elm specialist. So I actually got some elm seeds from the University of Delaware, planted them. Now we've got a number of elm trees at our house, and the caterpillar came right away. Wanted the evening primrose moth because it's beautiful. I like beauty like anybody else. So I planted evening primrose. The moth came. It spends the day with its head sticking in the flowers. It's very cute. And we planted a lot of oaks. Now, these are just examples of the plants we've added to our house, but I want to focus on oaks for a while because they are such important species. This is the Bedford oak in Bedford, New York. People argue about whether it's 400 years old or 500 years old. And you know, I hear people say all the time that I don't want to plant an oak because I'm not going to live long enough to enjoy it. Well, if you can only enjoy your oak when it's 400 years old or 500 years old, you're right. You're not going to live long enough. But if you enjoy what your oak is doing, what it's contributing to your property, you can enjoy it immediately. And I can tell you that from experience because I planted our oaks mostly as acorns, but some were 2-foot bare root whips. Acorns, by the way, free, bare root whips, $1.50. And immediately they started to attract the moths that run the food webs that bring in so many other creatures to our yards. Things like the solitary oak leaf miner, the juvenile's dusky wing, the yellow-solered moth, the orange-headed epicalema, the red-washed caterpillar, the yellow-vested moth, the orange-tufted oneida, the spiny oak caterpillar, the two-spotted oak pumpkin, the variable oak leaf caterpillar, the red-humped oakworm, the orange-humped oakworm, the pink-striped oakworm, the delightful dagger moth, the pleasant dagger moth, the lesser oak dagger moth, the greater oak dagger moth, the streaked dagger moth, the afflicted dagger moth, the crowned bucolatrix, the white blotch heterocampa, the oblique heterocampa, the red-lined panapoda, the laugher, and literally hundreds more species of moths have come to the oaks on our property, and they come right away. This is a pin oak that has just popped its head above the leaves, and here's a crocus geometer standing on the ground eating the leaves of that plant. So they start to contribute to your local food web immediately. This is what our house will look like in a month or two. I'm sitting in this window right now here. So I just want to convince you that we're very traditional. We've got some lawn here, but put a lot of plants back. And of course, right away, we noticed all the biodiversity that those plants started to bring to our yard. 4 years ago, I made it a goal, very challenging goal, but I took up the goal of taking a picture of every species of moth I could find on our property. Again, focusing on moths because they are the center of that food web. I'm still at it, but I'm up to 1,033 species of moths that I have photographed at our house. I don't know how many there actually are, but that's more species of birds than in all of North America. Now we've got 10 acres. Pennsylvania's 2.4 million acres. So on 1/240,000th of the land area, we have 40% of all the moth species that occur in the entire state. And since so many of these are types of bird food, we've recorded 59 species of birds that have bred on our 10 acres, not flew by, but bred. which means this works. You put the plants back, it works. We saw this headline this fall. World Wildlife Fund says that Earth has lost 2/3 of its wildlife since 1970. But I'm thinking, not at our house. I bet for sure that we have increased biodiversity by more than 2/3, and it didn't take that long. And we did it simply by putting the plants back. So we see these terrible headlines, but let's not despair. We can turn it around, get rid of the non-native plants, put in the natives that support them, and we can turn this around. But I know what you're thinking. We've got 10 acres and a lot of people have smaller properties. So will it work in a typical suburban lot? That is a good question. Let's go to Margie and Dan Terpster's house in Kirkwood, Missouri. The major invasive plant in Kirkwood, Missouri is Amur honeysuckle, or bush honeysuckle. So the first thing they did when they bought their property, which is 0.6 acres, 18 times less property than what Cindy and I have. First thing they did was get rid of their bush honeysuckle. Then they planted a lot of native plants, and then they put in a water feature they call a bubbler. And then they sat back and started to count the birds that have used their yard. They're up to 149 species, including 35 warbler species. Just to put that in perspective, we've only recorded 8 warbler species at our house. And they are in a typical suburban neighborhood. I visited them. Believe me, they're surrounded by the big lawns, so it does work on smaller properties. What about urban yards? Let's go to Pam Carlson's house in Chicago. And I mean in Chicago, because right on the other side of this wall is one of the runways of O'Hare Airport. Right over here is Kennedy Expressway. Pam has 1/10 of an acre. That's 3 times smaller than the average lot size in North America. But she did the same thing. She got rid of her invasive plants, put in 60 species of native plants, a little water feature, and then she started to count the birds that use her yard. And she's up to 118 species of birds that have used her yard, including a woodcock. There's Pam's woodcock. So if you haven't seen a woodcock lately, go to Pam's house in Chicago. She is not, there's no connectivity with Pam's house in any other natural area. So she's a tiny little island, yet it's working. There are 4 things we need to think about, though, if we want it to work big time. And one of them is we've got to shrink the area that's in lawn. So, you know, we don't think of grass as an invasive species, but it surely is. And even if it doesn't move, we plant it everywhere. We've got more than 40 million acres of grass, of lawn in this country, which is bigger than all of New England, by the way. And you know why we have it, because it's a status symbol that says we're good citizens. We're taking care of the land, even though we're making giant ecologically dead zones by doing that. So let's keep our status symbol where the lawn we keep will be manicured, we'll still be good citizens, but let's put some plants back. Let's cut the area of lawn in half. And if we do that, if we replant half the area that's in lawn right now, that'll give us 20 million acres to put towards conservation. That'll be right where humans live. If we do it at home, we can create a new national park that I'm calling Homegrown National Park. And it'll be bigger than the Adirondacks, plus Yellowstone, plus Yosemite, plus Grand Tetons, Canyonlands, Mount Rainier, North Cascades, Badlands National Park, Olympic National Park, plus Sequoia National Park, the Grand Canyon, plus Denali, which is huge, plus the Great Smoky Mountains. You add up all those parks, still less than 20 million acres. So we will have the biggest national park in the country. What do we get when you put a park at home? Well, you get the chance to develop a personal relationship with the natural world at your own time, at your own pace. All you have to do is walk outside. Really important, because without that connection to nature, you don't care about it, and you certainly won't be a good steward of it. You can do this by avoiding crowds. I mean, if you go to a real national park these days, there are millions of people there. So that's what you're dealing with. It's also free. There's no admission fee, and it's never closed, no matter what pandemic comes down the road. No travel hassles. You just walk outside. You get to experience the natural world alone. And I think this is critically important. I don't know how you can develop that personal relationship unless you are alone with nature. And it's very, doubly important for our kids who are suffering from nature deficit disorder. They're not exposed to the natural world. They're afraid of it. So, we're trying. We get 30 kids, put them on a bus with a teacher, and they drive for an hour, and then they walk around a natural area. Then teacher tells them not to touch anything, by the way. Then they get back on the bus and they drive home. And that's their experience with the natural world, which I'm sure is better than nothing. But what it really is an experience with 30 other kids and a teacher telling them not to touch anything. If they have some part of nature right in their yard, they can go outside alone, no parental supervision. Let them interact by themselves risk it. Most of them will make it home alive. But they're going to remember they are the future stewards of our planet. They've got to develop that personal relationship or they'll be lousy stewards. And maybe they will learn how to hunt lizards. I'm learning this from my own granddaughter, Zoe, who lives in Hawaii on a very modest piece of nature. It's grass and a hedge. But there are anoa lizards there. So she sent me this picture to explain how you catch lizards. You get on the ground, you disguise yourself with sticks and leaves so the lizards don't see you coming. And then you crawl very slowly toward the lizard. No smiling. This is serious business. You can wear your best dress, that's okay, but you sneak up on the lizard, you catch the lizard, you put it in an aquarium, and now you have a personal relationship with that part of nature. Now, I don't think Zoe is going to be crawling on the ground in her best dress, catching lizards the rest of her life. I don't think. But I guarantee she's going to remember doing this in Hawaii the rest of her life. And I also guarantee she will be a good steward of the planet, in part because of this experience. All right, we're going to shrink the lawn. What are we going to put in the areas we take out of lawn? Well, some of the plants we put in are going to have to be what I call keystone plants. Remember the Roman arch? The keystone is the stone right in the center of that arch. And if you take that keystone out, the arch collapses. Well, that's the role of keystone plants in food webs. If we take them out of the food web collapses. Why? Because the keystone plants are making most of the food. Just 5% of our native plants are supporting 75% of the caterpillar food that drives those food webs. 14% of our native plants are supporting 90% of the caterpillar food that drives those food webs, which means 85, 86% of our native plants are contributing, but not all that much. If we're rebuilding a food web, you're building an ecological house. Think of the keystone plants as the 2x4s that are holding that house up. They're essential. The house isn't going to stand without them. You cannot build a house out of wallpaper. It doesn't mean you're finished once you have the 2x4s there, but they are essential. And that's what a keystone plant is. So the question is no longer simply, are natives better than non-natives? On average, they certainly are, but there are a whole bunch of natives that aren't supporting all that much either. So we want to focus on the ones that are the most productive. At least they have to be part of our food web. They're better than the ones that are doing very little and much better than the ones that are invasive, those non-native ornamentals like calorie pear, like burning bush that escape our yards and biologically pollute, ecologically castrate all the land around us. I get an email once or twice a year from somebody saying, don't you know that ginkgos, ginkgo biloba from Asia, actually grew in North America 7 million years ago? That makes them native. That means we can plant them and everything will be great. Yes, I do know that ginkgos grew in North America 7 million years ago. We can argue about whether that makes them native today, but I'm not going to have that argument because that's not the metric anymore. It's not whether they're native or not, it's whether they're productive or not. I don't care if ginkgos grew in the moon 7 million years ago. They produce 0 species of caterpillars here in Delaware. So you can have them, but they're just there. They're not supporting the local food web. What is going to support our food web better than anything else? Well, the top keystone plant, not just here, but in 84% of the counties of North America, would be one of the oaks. Anything in the genus Quercus. There are 557 species of caterpillars, 557 species of bird food supported by oaks here in the mid-Atlantic states, 900 species nationwide. There is no other plant genus that comes close to that. So just to emphasize that, this is the role of keystone oaks, that the role they are playing in our yard here. Now remember, I've taken pictures of 1,033 species of moths. We haven't gotten to the butterflies yet. Out of that 1,033 species, 909 have known host plants. So there's more than 100 we don't know what they're eating. Out of the 909 species, 269 species use oaks. Now we have 69 genera of native woody plants on our property, and only one of them is the genus Quercus. And we've got hundreds of genera of herbaceous plants. So oaks represent less than 1.5% of our woody plant diversity and way less than 1% of our total plant diversity, but they're supporting at least 30% of our moss species diversity. So imagine what would happen to the diversity at our house if we took oaks away. That's the central role that keystone plants play in an ecosystem. How do you find out what your keystone plants are? You go to Native Plant Finder, National Wildlife Federation, put in your zip code and the ranked list of the top plants in your county. ranked in terms of the number of species of caterpillars they support, will pop up for your county, both the woody plants and the herbaceous plants. And the lists are much bigger than this. I stopped because I ran out of room here. One thing I want to emphasize here is that, notice I say native oaks, native cherries, native willows. If I go to the nursery and I say, I want to buy a cherry, they'll sell me an ornamental cherry from Asia. If I want to buy a willow, they'll sell me a weeping willow from Turkey. Want to buy a birch, they'll sell me a European birch. Even if I ask for an oak, chances are good I'll get a sawtooth oak from China, which, by the way, is highly invasive. Specify, these are great genera, but you need the natives from those genera. If you don't, you're going to reduce caterpillar use by 65%. We've done that experiment. These are the top herbaceous genera. Goldenrod's always way up there. The various genera of asters these days, way up there. Sunflowers, particularly the perennial species. Not only are they the best genera in terms of supporting caterpillars, they're the best genera in terms of supporting specialist bees. There are over 40 species of bees that won't be in your yard unless you have those three genera there. So we're going to shrink the lawn, we're going to put in keystone plants, we're going to attract a lot of insects to our yard, and then we're going to kill them with our security light, which is not the goal. There's a lot of research coming in very rapidly now that is pretty convincing. That says that light pollution, the lights we have on at night, are one of the major causes of insect decline, particularly in the temperate zone around the world. A lot of the research is coming from Europe, but these are all the ways that lights kill our insects. Through exhaustion, the insects fly around and around until they just get exhausted and die. They die from colliding with the light, getting incinerated, from dehydration. The bat comes and eats them. Bright lights blind a lot of our night insects. Who knew? And it messes up their the things they ought to be doing on a day-to-day basis. To me, this is actually really good news. This is exciting news because we absolutely have to turn around this insect decline. That's not tolerable if we want to remain on this planet. So this turns out to be a really convenient way to do it. Just flick a switch, turn out a light. Nothing could be easier. But I know what you're going to say. I can't turn out my night light because the bad man will come. Okay, put a motion sensor on your security light so it only turns on when the bad man does come. And the first thing you're going to learn is that the bad man doesn't come very often. And if you don't want to do that, take the white bulb out of your security light, and a mercury vapor lamp is the very worst, and put in a yellow bulb. A yellow LED bulb is the best because they are the least attractive. Yellow wavelengths are the least attractive to nocturnal insects. If we switched out our lights for yellow LED bulbs overnight, we would save billions of insects and probably billions of dollars too, because they're a lot more energy efficient. Fourth thing we need to do is to landscape in a way that allows caterpillars to complete their development. What do I mean by that? Well, I live in Chester County, Pennsylvania, where oaks support 511 species of caterpillars. A few of them, like the Polyphemus moth, complete their development on the tree. The caterpillar eats the leaves, then it spins a cocoon and hangs from one of the branches, then it emerges as an adult and then does it all over again. And I wish everything did that, but most species don't. Most species will grow as much as they're going to on the leaves, 480, 94% of those species. They'll finish growing as caterpillars and then they drop from the tree and they wiggle their way beneath the ground and pupate underground, or they spin a cocoon in the leaf litter that is under the tree. And then that's how they spend the winter and then they emerge the next year. The problem is, of course, we don't have any leaf litter under the trees, and we mow and compact our soil to the point where it's rock hard and the caterpillars can't get underground. So I'm convinced, and you know we do this everywhere, this type of landscaping without thinking about the area under our trees has become an ecological trap. We're calling in moths to lay their eggs, caterpillars develop, then they drop down and die. And of course, the cement landscape is even less of a viable option. I'm not trying to discourage the use of trees in our cities. I'm trying to discourage the profligate use of cement, which of course destroys our watersheds. We know that. And it's also a major releaser of carbon dioxide. This is what most people do. You have a big tree in the lawn. Now, nobody's measured the success of caterpillars in a situation like this. We were going to do this last summer, but the COVID said no. But I guarantee it is much higher than this. This is a shot from Mount Cuba. You might recognize it. Here's a tree in a layered landscape. There could be a dogwood over here, then a native azalea and ferns and ground covers. The caterpillar drops down to a safe site. It can easily get beneath the ground because it's not compacted. Nobody's going to mow it or step on it. It can spin a cocoon in any leaf litter that's under there. Much higher survivorship in a situation like that. Or this is where you can do your spring ephemeral gardening. This is how you shrink the lawn, by the way. You put big beds around your trees. They all become safe sites. This is where you can use your ground covers, things like wild ginger or foam flower or mayapple or ferns. Ferns are a wonderful place for those caterpillars to complete their development. This is a hotel in Athens, Georgia. Any caterpillar developing on these red maples here can drop down and make it right in the middle of a city. More good news from another one of my students, Desiree Narango, who did some wonderful work with chickadees in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. And her results suggest that there is room for compromise in our plant choice. But this is how it goes. What she did was look at the ability for landscapes, suburban landscapes, to support chickadee populations when they were landscaped primarily with native plants versus landscapes that were dominated by introduced plants. What she found is when they're dominated by introduced plants, they produce 75% fewer caterpillars. So right away, there's 75% less bird food there for the chickadees. They were 60% less likely to have breeding chickadees at all. Now there's nest boxes up in all the landscapes, but the chickadees would come and look around and say, there's not enough food here. We're not even going to try to breed. If they did try, those nests contain 1.5 fewer eggs. Those clutches were 29% less likely to survive at all. If they did survive, they produced 1.2 fewer fledglings, and it took them 1.5 days longer to do that. And if you put all those numbers into a population growth model as a function of the percentage of non-native woody plants that you have in your landscape, this is what you get. This dotted line is the replacement rate. That's the rate at which the population has to make babies in order to replace the adults that die every year. If you make that many babies, your population is sustainable. It's not growing, but it's not shrinking either. It can go on forever. If you make more babies than adults die, you've got a growing population. But if you make fewer babies, anything below the dotted line here, you've got a shrinking, unsustainable population. Right here is where those lines generously overlap, which suggests you can have up to 30% of your woody plant biomass non-native, as long as it's not invasive. We can't tolerate any invasives, but a lot of ornamentals are not invasive. Up to 30% and still have a sustainable bird population, which means 70% of your woody plant biomass has to be native. So right here is that area of compromise I'm talking about. You can have your ginkgo, you can have your crepe myrtle, you can have your boxwood. Those things are not invasive, as long as it doesn't dominate the landscape. And to me, that's good news, because if my message was we can't have any non-native plants, very few people would listen. Remember, it's not the presence of non-native plants that destroys food webs. It is the absence of native plants. And that's one of the problems of those invasive plants. They displace the native plant communities that actually make the food that everything depends on. Can municipalities help us live with nature? Of course they can, and more are doing it. I hear new examples on a regular basis now. Minnesota has a cost-sharing program that is encouraging homeowners to replace some or all of their lawn with appropriate Minnesota prairie plants. They help you pay for it. Pennsylvania, I just learned about this 2 weeks ago. There's a lawn conversion program. You get up to $5,000 per acre to help you pay for converting your giant lawn into a good habitat. What a great program. And apparently Maryland has something similar. Florida, there's an island of Florida that's paying people to allow burrowing owls to burrow in the front yard. This is the way, burrowing owls, of course, are listed species. This is the way the Endangered Species Act should have been written, with carrots rather than sticks. Rather than fining somebody because they use their property if they've got an endangered species on it, we should pay them to protect that species. Everybody would want an invasive species. It would turn it around immediately. An endangered species. Missouri and Fayetteville, Arkansas had a bounty on Callery pears. Callery pears, of course, Bradford pear is one of the worst invasives that we have out there. If you take down a Callery pear, they give you a free tree replacement. And even water utilities are getting into the act. San Antonio Water Systems giving people $100 coupons to take out water thirsty plants from China and putting in the water efficient native plants in particular areas. Then a lot of lawn conversion programs in the far west, particularly California, where they don't have enough water for lawns. You get up to $2 per square foot rebate for replacing your thirsty lawn with xeric plantings. I think we made 3 missteps in the early years of conservation. And this is a big one right here. You know, we like nature. Some of us even think it's important, but not essential. And that means when push comes to shove, when resources are in short supply, nature always takes a backseat. I went to the Cincinnati Zoo before the virus broke out, and there was this wall-sized poster there that epitomizes our society's view of conservation. We want to save wildlife for future generations to enjoy. That was Teddy Roosevelt's reasoning for starting the national park system. We got to save these wonderful places so that people in future generations can enjoy them. And I agree with that, but it suggests nature's there just for our entertainment. No wonder we don't think it's essential. Entertainment's not essential when resources are in short supply. But but nature's much more than entertainment. We need to save nature so that we have future generations. It's a little bit more urgent. We've also assumed that humans and nature cannot coexist. Now, we talked about this, but if we restrict conservation efforts to areas where there's not a lot of humans, we're going to fail because those areas are not big enough and they're too isolated from each other. David Quammen has an excellent analogy between a Persian rug and an ecosystem. This is a functional Persian rug. That is not 71 Persian rugs. That's 71 rug fragments, none of which are acting like a Persian rug. And that's what we've done to our ecosystems. The UN designates biosphere reserves as places of ecological significance. And I hate that language because it suggests there are places on planet Earth with no ecological significance. Not so. Every square inch of the planet has ecological significance. Every square inch of Delaware has ecological significance. So let's glue our ecosystems back together again, glue our rug back together again by putting in the plants that are going to support viable habitats where right now we don't have any. We're not just making connections between existing habitats so that plants and animals can move back and forth in corridors. You hear a lot of talk about biological corridors. We're going to create viable habitat in between those true habitats so that things can live outside of those habitats. In other words, we're going to start to share with nature the places where we live, where we work, where we play, even where we farm. Our third misstep was to leave Earth stewardship to just a few specialists, few conservation biologists, few ecologists. We didn't see it as an inherent responsibility of every human being on the planet. But I don't know why, because every human being on the planet depends entirely on the quality of the Earth's ecosystems. So why wouldn't everybody bear the responsibility for good Earth stewardship? Stan Rushworth, a Cherokee elder, once said that the Western settler mindset is, I have rights. The mindset of indigenous people is, I have obligations. You were not born with these mindsets, you're taught them. We are good at teaching this one. We have been terrible at teaching our kids and our peers that we all have obligations towards Earth stewardship. It doesn't mean you have to save biodiversity for a living, but you really can save it where you live. And I love this approach because it empowers each one of us. You know, right now, so many people feel powerless. You know, the Earth's problems are huge, and it really seems like one person cannot make a difference. But in this case, the cliche works. One person can go outside and plant that oak tree. They can shrink their lawn. They can get rid of the invasive plants on their property. They can put in a pollinator garden. And they can watch the life in their local ecosystem come back. They can create a landscape that enhances their local ecosystem instead of degrades it. One person. So that one person becomes an important cog in the future wheel of conservation. You are empowered. It also shrinks the problem to something that's manageable for each one of us. Don't think of the entire planet's problem. You'll get depressed if you do that. Just think about the part of the Earth that you can influence. If you own property, that's where you start. If you don't own property, help somebody who does. Help a land conservancy, help a park or preserve. They're all underfunded and understaffed. They will love you. So as property owners or as volunteers, each one of us has the power. And we certainly have the responsibility to fix dead landscapes like this. Whether or not we choose to do so is going to determine nature's fate and then ultimately our own fate. I think I've convinced my grandchildren that you are nature's best hope. I hope I've convinced you as well. Thanks very much.
That's really great. Thank you very much, Doug. That has been incredibly inspiring and motivating. I think the idea that we all have agency after a year of COVID confinement is a great message, and great timeliness, because it's time to get outside. The garden centers are going to be filling up with native plants in the near future. So thank you for bringing your inspirational message that everything we do in our yards makes a difference for the ecology. I wonder, we have a few questions. Do you mind if I kind of go to the chat and pull up a couple of these questions?
Absolutely.
First, someone asked about, can you talk about the various effects of emerging pathogens, pests, and climate change on oaks and oak hickory ecosystems, and what types of oaks may be best for folks to choose for their landscapes given those stressors?
Okay, there's about 4 questions in there. First of all, I got a student right now, an undergraduate, who's comparing 16 species of oaks, and I might see the data even this week. He's late in turning it in, so I soon will be able to tell you which oaks are the best around here in terms of supporting at least the insects that run those ecosystems. But I will say that I'm not expecting huge differences. Oaks all protect themselves pretty much the same way. They use tannins as a defense, and insects that can adapt to tannins can probably use any plant that uses tannins. So if you're good at eating a white oak, you're probably good at eating a red oak as well. I'll make a prediction though, from my own observations. One of the oaks that's being pushed by the horticultural trade right now is swamp white oak. I guess because it's easier to grow and maybe easier to transplant. But if you compare those leaves, they're very thick and they're hairy compared to other oak leaves. And my observation is they're supporting fewer insects than any of the other oaks. So we'll see if that bears out. But even a swamp white oak is going to support a whole lot more than many other types of plants. So oaks are all good. The stressors, climate change is a terrible one. Because of the extreme variability that everything is experiencing, not just the oaks, everything that's growing out there. It's 70 degrees one day, 30 degrees the next day. You get you get a thunderstorm that drops 8 inches of rain in 3 hours. Then you have a drought. I mean, extreme variability is going to be hard on the plants. It's certainly hard on the insects. It was 2 summers ago, we had a thunderstorm in our backyard that literally dropped 6 inches. It was 7 inches of rain in 3 hours. And it was like a fire hose. I'm always looking at caterpillars on the leaves in my yard. And after that storm, there weren't any. They were just hosed off of there. And I think they're still recovering from that single storm, and we're getting them time and time again. The diseases we keep bringing in, oak leaf scorch, very hard on the red oak group. You go a little farther west and it's oak wilt, which is hard on the white oak group. And it's, it's not just our oaks. We got emerald ash borer killing the ashes. All these things we keep bringing in are creating challenges that eventually will work their way out, but we're clobbering our forests with these challenges all at once. The response often is, well, let's not plant oaks anymore because they're going to get sick. Or let's stop planting ashes. That's the worst thing we can do, in my opinion, because what we need to do is look for the resistant genotypes that are out there. There are oaks right in my yard that are resistant to oak leaf scorch, for example. I've got a couple trees that are dying. They're going to die, but the others are okay. And right away, that pushes selection towards the resistant ones, because guess whose acorns fall in the fall? It's the resistant ones, and those are the acorns that the jays will move. The susceptible ones are not going to make any acorns. So if we stop planting our trees, even though they're getting diseases, we won't discover the resistant genotypes that are going to be the future of our American forests. But I don't, a lot of people want to do assisted migration where you're moving plants up from the south. I don't recommend that because, just look at what happened a couple of weeks ago in Texas. You get a polar vortex come down unusually cold, you'll kill everything that you just moved up from the south. So it's finding plants that can handle the extreme variability that is happening now. And it's not a gentle warming from the south. So I don't support that.
Great. Another question someone asked, how important is a water feature? And can it be done without water pumps and heaters?
If you're trying to attract birds, it depends on where your yard is in relation to an existing body of water. And if you have a stream or a river nearby, it doesn't do that much. But if you're in an area that's relatively dry, it really does attract a lot of birds. Moving water does attract them better than non-moving water, because birds are looking for clean water. And if you hear water trickling, it's a signal that the water is well oxygenated and clean, and that's what the birds really want. So that's the value of the little water pump, or even a little drip is good enough to attract a lot of birds. So that has been shown to be more attractive.
Great. We also had a couple of questions about defoliation and pests. Someone was talking about they get aphids on their the Asclepias, and we're just wondering what to do about that. And then the other thing is that the caterpillars themselves defoliate sometimes, especially Asclepias. They do that in my yard, and people were asking, is that a problem? And if so, what to do about it?
Well, let's think about why we're planting that Asclepias. We're trying to help the monarch, and the caterpillar that's defoliating your Asclepias is either a monarch. I've heard, had people calling up and say, I planted a milkweed and a worm ate it, so I squished the worm. The worm, of course, is the monarch butterfly, and you don't want to squish the monarch. There's also the milkweed caterpillar that is gregarious, and they can strip the whole thing. What it means is you don't have enough milkweeds. You want a milkweed patch, not a few ramets there. Those are native herbivores of milkweed. It's part of the system. It does not kill your milkweed. It kills that, it destroys that ramet, but the root is happy and it'll come up from that root again. Milkweed's very resilient to that type of herbivory. I am in no way encouraging invasive insects. So the aphid that is on your milkweed, that is an invasive aphid from South America. Insects that we bring in without their natural enemies cause huge problems, just like the invasive plants. So we don't want gypsy moth, we don't want emerald ash borer, we don't want hemlock woolly adelgid, and all the other things we bring in that cause these problems, because they're here without their natural enemies. There are very few native insects that regularly defoliate. We do have a few. Tent caterpillars in the spring, soon they'll be out, make their little tents. They can defoliate small cherries, and fall webworms make those ugly nests. They are boom and bust species, and sometimes they're really abundant, and sometimes they eat a lot. If your tree is healthy, they won't hurt it. I had a black cherry in my yard, defoliated 10 years in a row. It's happy as a clam. They're adapted to that. It's only stressed trees that suffer from that. So the reason we don't like those insects for the most part is because they make those ugly tents, and it must remind us of spiders or something. But they're making a lot of bird food. The yellow-bill and black-bill cuckoo depend on those hairy caterpillars, and they'll slice open the tents. Just one little aside, last summer I had 101 tents in my yard. And I went around, all of a sudden, they just didn't seem to be getting any bigger. And I went around, every single one was sliced open, and all the caterpillars had been eaten by a cuckoo that I kept hearing. I never did see it. One bird did all of that. So nature can control itself if we allow it to be diverse enough.
Well, that's a really great message and a great one to end on. Thank you so much, Doug, for spending some time with us. You do have a brand new book out that's really great. It talks a lot about all of these wonderful strategies. So everybody out there, if you want to learn more about this, there's, go out and get a copy of this. Amazon will deliver it to you by tomorrow, probably.
That's right.
Thanks. Then I have the pleasure of concluding this wonderful event this morning and now afternoon. and I will do so expeditiously so that we don't take up much of everybody's time. But I have the opportunity to talk about what comes next. This has been just such a great day of celebrating the invasive species bill, now law, which is a great step forward for conservation in Delaware. But this was also meant to be a kickoff for our the Native Species Commission's public outreach efforts, which are being brought together under the banner and branding of Delaware Naturally, is what we're calling these outreach efforts. And it is meant to be a statewide campaign to bring together all of this wonderful conservation enthusiasm and knowledge that Collin O'Mara spoke so eloquently about just a couple of hours ago, and try to figure out how do we leverage this conservation mindset and expertise to maximize the impact of our efforts. So to do that, we have 2 additional sessions coming up the next couple of Wednesdays to talk more in depth. These will be more working meetings. They're not going to be presentations so much. There will be brief presentations to start each one. But for the most part, these next 2 workshops are going to be breakout sessions where we're going to break the group up into smaller groups to discuss what are the areas and what are the means by which we together, the conservation community of Delaware, might work together to amplify our impact and make a measurable difference. So between now and then, I hope that everybody here is interested and has the time to sign up and participate in these roundtable workshops the next couple of weeks. But that's the question, the main question to be thinking about is what are the ways through which, and Collin again spoke of the opportunity we have to leverage all of these conservation resources. What are the ways that people imagine we could best utilize this energy, this enthusiasm, this kind of groundswell of motivation that we see rising to benefit biodiversity and improve the habitats and ecosystems that make up the great state of Delaware? So the first one is going to be next Wednesday. That one's going to be at a different time. It's going to be in the afternoon. These aren't nearly as long as this celebration was today. On next Wednesday, the 24th, it will be from 1 to 2:30 p.m. And that one will be on conservation in natural areas. And then the following Wednesday, on Wednesday, March 31st, that one will again be in the morning. That'll be 9 a.m. to 10:30. And in that meeting, we will get together and have a conversation about conservation in the built environment and in backyards and metropolitan areas and all of that kind of stuff. So please, if you go to the Delaware Center for Horticulture's website, is where you can find the registration information. So if you go there and look under their upcoming programs, you can find these and register. They're all free. The point of this is really just to gather our conservation-minded citizens of Delaware to talk about how do we amplify our efforts? What do we want to do with this momentum that we're establishing going forward? And how do we make the best use of the minds and energy that we have here in the state? So that's, I think, all I have, unless anybody has any other closing parting thoughts. Oh, the registration information is there in the chat. So you can get that information there. And without further ado, I think we have successfully completed a wonderful kickoff for Delaware Naturally and signing of the legislation banning the sale and import-export of invasive species in the state of Delaware. So congratulations. Thank you all for coming and spending time with us this morning, afternoon. And I hope that you will come back in the next couple of weeks for these workshop roundtables and participate and share your thoughts and your enthusiasm. And I look forward to seeing you there. Thanks for coming.